Welcome back to BCfm's Politics Show with Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers and me, Tony Gosling. A new president of Malaysia, well, relatively new, and a new documentary on the 2015 downing of MH17. It's a call for justice, and it's produced by freelance Dutch journalist Max van der Werf. You won't be seeing it on the BBC. Why? Because it implicates fascists in Ukraine, with NATO and the Dutch authorities in falsifying evidence against Russia. So why would they cover up the real culprits who shot down the plane? Just to have a go at the Russians? And tanker wars. The latest, we go back to 1987, just before the first Gulf War, when US warships were escorting Kuwaiti tankers by sending the tankers out ahead of the warships in case of mines. Doesn't sound much like escorting to me. YouTube have been censoring my videos this week, classifying the linking of Israel and Israelis to the 9/11 attacks as anti-Semitic hate speech, apparently. We hear from Chris Bollin on the strong connections between Israeli Secret Service Mossad and the Hollywood film industry, making films very similar to 9/11 attacks. We're not saying that these film producers did it, we're just making these comparisons, but apparently that's hate speech. And Yukiya Amano dropped dead this week. Who's he, I hear you say? Only the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Authority. He's charged with the oversight of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Plus, in Austria, a very serious case. News that one of their most dangerous mafia dons, Faruk Orman, is going to be released now. And possibly another, Tony Mokbel, because of their lawyer, Nicola Gobbo, was secretly a police informer all along. And no special tariffs on Huawei electronics firm from China. Just that FedEx's postal company is refusing to deliver their mail. Just another provocation against China from the Trump administration, jealous of the Chinese tech company's market lead. Our sister show Dialects here on BCfm on Tuesday at noon this week, the second of a two-part series on the Glastonbury Abbey sphere of influence before the dissolution. In the 1530s, we hear how the medieval providers of education and medical care had their own army, which the abbot could summon from his home in Shapwick whenever he wanted it. And we travel to Mere and the vast lakes of fish used to feed the monks, presumably on a Friday, this region and beyond. So you can listen here at BCfm 93.2 at noon next Tuesday to that, or download it right now from dialectradio.co.uk. But Martin, I think we better start with the tanker wars, because this time last week the Iranians were descending onto a British registered tanker and have impounded it, haven't they?
Yeah, and what's really significant about this is the insurance for British tankers operating in the Gulf has shot through the roof, and various tanker operators are trying to...
But they just pass that on to the petrol companies, surely?
Well, no, what's happening is that basically people are re-registering their tankers as not British, because that's what you do to get around that, isn't it?
Where's this heading then, do you think?
Well, it's hard to say.
They've released some of the crew, apparently.
Well, the crew, yeah. But they're still holding the Iranian tanker with its oil. And,
in Gibraltar.
And of course they were trying to enforce what are supposedly EU sanctions, but Iran is not part of EU sanctions, and in any case EU sanctions are not actually legal, because sanctions are supposed to be carried out via the UN Security Council, which obviously hasn't happened in this case.
So what's really going on behind the scenes, do you think?
Well, it's pretty clear, I think, that the deep state in Britain was told by the deep state in the US and the Israelis who have their influence there to seize this tanker as a way of dragging Britain into confrontation with Iran and splitting the British off from the French, the Germans and the other EU countries who want to carry on trading with Iran.
Let's be absolutely clear about this, and I'll put a link up on our show page to the map. You can see clearly that the tanker was seized in disputed Moroccan international waters, and then it was moved into the Gibraltar waters by these Marines. So it was deliberately taken out of international waters. This does sound like piracy.
Well, it is. It is piracy, and of course, what's happened with the other ship, the British registered ship, the Stena Imperio, which means the Imperial Strait. The Mirror this week had a story saying that the Russians had used GPS hacking to confuse the ship and make it sail into Iranian waters, and therefore that's why it was seized. And I was asked to comment about this week on RT, but I couldn't do it because I was out of Bristol. And of course, what I would have said if I had commented for RT is...
OK, do your little RT
job
now.
What the British have been saying is that they were in international waters, but what the Mirror is saying that they were in Iranian waters, but they'd been misled by the Russians into Iranian waters. Now, if they're in Iranian waters, there's no reason for the Iranians not to be able to interdict them if they want to. There's nothing that anybody can do to stop it. But of course, the question is, do we want to escalate this into everybody starts arresting everybody else's tankers?
Everybody seems to have forgotten about the tanker wars back in the Persian Gulf in 1987. This is 2 years before the first Gulf War. But the Iranians won't have forgotten that, and neither has the writer Robert Fisk, who's been writing about this in the run-up to that first Gulf War. So this is not unprecedented at all, this sort of thing going on in that specific strait of water.
The Miller Patrol, which was originally sent there, was sent there to protect essentially Iraqi. We were on the Iraqi side in the Iraq-Iran war. Basically, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran in 1980 to upset the Iranian Revolution.
Would you do that for the Americans?
Sorry?
For the Americans, who were very annoyed?
And the British. Don't forget, the British and the Americans overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran in 1954 because they nationalised the oil
the Iranians had their revolution in 1979, but very quickly Armilla turns up.
Well, not Armilla, but very quickly Saddam Hussein invaded Iran because basically the same thing happened after the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. You have a revolution, but you're not allowed to have your revolution. The nearby powers immediately intervene to try and squash it. And Saddam Hussein invaded Iran on a pretext, supported by the West, including the British. And of course, he couldn't win the war. The Iranians were too tough for him. And then it turned into a war of attrition. And of course, the obvious thing that the Iranians were doing was trying to knock out, Kuwaiti and Iraqi tankers. And that's why they started using, putting. They were basically the Americans gave Kuwaiti tankers. They re-registered them as American tankers, but as you pointed out, as Robert Fisk pointed out in his article, when it came down to it, they had to actually the military ships had to file behind the tankers, which are much bigger, because if the tankers hit a mine, they'd probably survive better than
that's right. They had a thicker hull, because actually it's a much bigger ship because just carrying all this oil rather than military ships, which is smaller.
The military point here, Tony, is that the Persian Gulf is actually a death trap for military ships who are opposed to the Iranians. It would be like, the Iranians bringing their ships into the Channel and thinking that they were going to be able to beat the British in the Channel. It's just not going to happen.
That's right. The other thing that Fisk points out in this article, I'll put a link up to it on our show page, came out in the Independent Online on Monday and the iPaper on Tuesday, a shortened version, rather sadly shortened by I think it's Thompson that publishes the iPaper, is that these Armilla patrols, they finished in whatever it was, 1990s. He points out that the ship that's now sailing out there, we announced to join the patrol, is only going to be 2 British ships there for a very short period of time, and then the other one has to come home. So although we're saying we're reinforcing our presence in the Gulf, it'll only be for a week or so, and then this next ship will have to go, or the first ship will have to start chugging back to Britain, we only have apparently now 19 surface warships, where even back in the 1980s, of course, we had many more.
Well, this will be spun by the Tory press as we need to spend a load of money on new ships. Now, in actual fact, there is no way, if you go to war with the Iranians, that you will be able to protect any ships in the Gulf at all. They've got land-based anti-ship missiles, which will sink everything virtually immediately if you go to war with them. So you could say, we're having a British ship there to say, if you do shoot at us, then you're going to war with us. But there's no way that they can physically protect those ships. Basically, if there's a war in the Persian Gulf, all military ships which are hostile to Iran will be sunk almost immediately. The price of oil will shoot through the roof, and the world economy will collapse. It'll all happen in about 3 or 4 days. And lots of sailors will be killed, of course.
HMS Duncan and HMS Montrose going to Davy Jones Locker, do you think, or not?
Well, the Iranians do not want to fight, so they're not going to do it for the hell of it. But they've got to recognise that if you're going to make threats that you're going to shoot people, they may say, well, we're going to shoot back, and these are our waters, and you need to leave. Just as we would do. Can you imagine if the Iranians or the Chinese or the Russians brought a flotilla into the Channel and started making threats? They wouldn't last very long, because it's just the geography's against you, and the geography's completely against them here. And not to mention that all military analysis shows that they're definitely going to lose.
In a way, this Armilla patrol from the 1980s has given the Iranians a sort of reason to prepare their defences and to know exactly what to do.
They've been preparing for this battle for years and years and years and years and years. And they basically, look at the way they...
Take us through what you think might happen.
Well, the obvious thing that's going to happen is the Iranians have got such strong hand that they're not looking for trouble. What they want is their ship to be released and for it to be allowed to carry on doing what it was doing. That's what this is all about. But if we started this, if we back off, then they'll back off.
If it turns nasty, what do you think are likely to be the sort of... which direction is it going to go? The United States... Are we talking about actually having US troops there?
Well,
British troops there? NATO troops?
Well, the only way... if it starts, it'll start quickly and it'll escalate quickly. And the Iranians will have all the advantages in the initial phases. The
Americans have got
apart from the air power, which
the Americans have got one of these amphibious landing ships.
But they're all in the US. You've got to bring them over the Atlantic first, and by the time they get there, the battle will be over.
No, they've got one over there.
Yeah,
now.
But one is not enough to invade a whole country like Iran. You can imagine an amphibious landing like D-Day took about 3 or 4 years to prepare, and you can't just have an amphibious landing. The US Marines storming ashore in Iran will be wiped out. Not to mention the ship they come from being sunk before they even get ashore. There's no chance of winning.
So what's this all about then, if they can't win militarily?
Because they think that they can use nuclear weapons or something like that. I mean, what Sheldon Adelson said, who's the main funder of the Republican Party and a big supporter of Trump, is we should just use a nuclear weapon on Iran, because that's what the Israelis want. We could just nuke Iran and then there won't be a problem anymore. That's the mentality.
The Iranians have successfully tested, we hear today, a medium-range missile, and Britain is to escort all UK flag vessels through the Straits of Hormuz from now on.
Well, what's going to happen is, as I say, the insurance companies have already made it clear that British flagships are going to have to pay a massive premium to operate there. So what's immediately happening is that everybody's not, don't flag your ship, just change the flagging on your ships. It's as simple as that. If it's only British ships that are going to be targets, well, let's have French ships, Japanese ships, whatever.
Well, it's not just in the Straits of Hormuz, or Persian Gulf, or the Gulf of Oman that tankers are being seized, or the Mediterranean. Ukraine has seized a Russian tanker in the Black Sea. One does wonder whether this whole tanker seizure thing with special forces coming down from helicopters and taking over the wheel room of these tankers is catching on. So the Ukrainians, apparently, Martin, have just seized a Russian tanker in the Black Sea.
Well, it may be that people who like to provoke. I mean, don't forget, there's a faction within the US and within the Ukraine that wants a war with Russia, that wants a war with Iran. So the escalation of this tanker seizure game could be their way to get the war started, and that's what they want. I mean, you've got to be absolutely clear about it. They want a war with Iran. They aren't looking to try and escape from a war with Iran. John Bolton, Pompeo, the people who, not Zelensky so much, but the military in Ukraine under the influence of NATO, they want a war.
The Ukrainians are saying that this is a response to the clash last year underneath the board.
The Kerch Strait.
The
Kerch
bridge.
Strait incident.
Yeah.
Well, yes, they can say that, but of course, if they do that, then the Russians are going to take countermeasures against them. It's like a game of chess. You can do that, and then the other side says, "Well, look, I can take your rook there."
I think one of the things
I can take your knight.
Millions of people,
you've opened it up.
Millions of people are thinking about here is this going to actually start to really affect the price of fuel? So diesel and petrol at the pumps.
Well, it's already starting.
Those with their electric cars will be smiling, won't they?
Well, it's already starting, as I've said. See, there was an interesting suggestion by Pepe Escobar, who writes for Asia Times as a Brazilian. Very good, interesting suggestion. All the Iranians have to do is declare the Straits of Hormuz a war zone. They don't have to shoot anybody. Just declare it a war zone, and then the insurers won't allow ships to move. They will just push the price of insurance up so much that it's not worth your while putting a ship in there.
It's a little bit like that MH17 incident, which we'll be talking about in a minute, isn't it? Because actually that was a war zone when that aircraft was shot down.
Yes,
amazingly.
it was diverted over the war zone by Ukrainian air traffic control.
It went on a more northerly route that day, didn't it, for whatever reason, by Ukrainian air traffic
the Ukrainian air traffic control deliberately directed it into the war zone.
Anyway, before we get away from the Middle East, let's have a listen to Theresa May and her last Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, where she was asked about Russian attacks on Idlib in Syria.
Victoria Prentice!
Mr. Speaker, 31 people were killed in Idlib yesterday and many tens of thousands of people displaced again. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for her personal commitment to Syria and for international development more widely, and I would like her to join with me in reassuring the people of Syria that all of us here will continue to remember them.
Can I say to my honourable friend, first of all, I commend the work that she did in setting up Singing for Syria, which has been raising funds for people in Syria, and the commitment that she has shown to the people of Syria. We remain, and the Conservative government will remain, committed to working for a political solution in Syria that can provide the stability and security that the people of Syria deserve.
Well, there's been more people killed in Idlib today, but loads more people probably have been killed in Yemen, but we don't hear much about that. Idlib is under the control of the Al-Nusra Front, which is the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda, and there's many thousands of non-Syrian rebels in that pocket. And of course, it's become absolutely clear that the so-called chemical weapons attack in Douma last year was actually basically a staged incident by the White Helmets, who've now been taken out of Syria by the Israeli intelligence services.
Yeah, Victoria Prentice is a Conservative MP for Banbury.
Well, there we are. No, so in other words, and don't forget that the seizure of the Iranian tanker we've just been talking about, because they're supposedly going to deliver oil to Syria. Now, in actual fact, Iran doesn't have sanctions on Syria. Iran's Syria's ally, so why can't they deliver oil to them if they want? Now, you could say, well, they shouldn't be allowed to do that because we're at war with the Syrian regime. And we fired various missiles from Akrotiri, they're based in Akrotiri in Cyprus. The RAF took their planes into the air and fired various missiles into Syria. And the Syrians wisely decided not to fire back, but they could have decided to fire back with their Russian allies and killed loads of RAF personnel, because loads of people have died in Syria since we started the war there with our support for jihadis in the 7 years ago.
The big problem, of course, with Iran is, you're talking about Syria there, but Iran is the centre of this, really, and that is the United States pulling out of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. And we've just seen this week the death of the guy who runs the International Atomic Energy Authority. Now, that is going to put the cat amongst the pigeons, surely. And also, we know that coups can happen in organisations like this, and that it all depends on these kind of international groups as to what's going to happen. We've seen also the use of these big international organisations like the International Atomic Energy Authority, the chemical weapons people, for example, including the Olympics Committee, actually being used as a tool of at the very least information war in order to try and blacken the name of so-called enemy countries.
Well, the Organisation for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, gave a report where they basically said, as far as we're concerned, there was a chemical weapons attack. But their original report was leaked, which was by the original investigator, who's actually a technical expert, and he said it definitely didn't happen and that the whole thing was staged. And that came out. So, in other words, these international organisations are supposedly independent, supposedly above the fray, and they should be in principle, but in practice, often they are not. They're being manipulated in various ways to come up with various results which have already been foreordained. So the OPCW basically said that there was a chemical weapons attack, even though their own internal advice was that there hadn't been one. And on the back of that, Britain fired missiles at the Syrian Arab Army, who've taken over 100,000 casualties. And, they might have fired back and killed some British people, and then we'd have gone, oh goodness, our British soldiers are dying, help for heroes. It's like, you shoot at people, they're going to shoot back at you. They've got a right to shoot back at you, just as the Houthi and the Yemeni army in Yemen have fired back at the Saudis. If you're going to keep bombing us, we're going to shoot back at you. Okay. Why are you allowed to shoot? We're not allowed to shoot back.
I mean, the big question, of course, is who's taking over as in running the International Atomic Energy Authority. Well, the chap's name is Cornel Feruta, and he's a Romanian diplomat, and he's going to be the interim IAEA chief. He's a graduate of Tokyo University, Faculty of Law. He's from the Japanese Foreign Ministry, posted to jobs in Belgium, France, Laos, Switzerland and the United States. He was then served as Japan's representative to the IAEA to his election of Director General in July 2009, including a stint as chair of the Board of Governors 2005 to 6. So he's very definitely not in the China-Russia camp. He's in the US and Romania and Japan camp.
Well, that's quite. I haven't really looked into this, Tony, but what you're suggesting doesn't sound at all implausible to me. It may be that this guy's just died anyway, and they use it as an opportunity to put somebody else.
Well, I'm not suggesting there's anything fishy about it, but it's not really being.
No,
it's
not beyond. It's not beyond the UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld was definitely assassinated by the British and the Americans in the Congo.
The role of the International Atomic Energy Authority in all of this, and particularly the JCPOA, is absolutely crucial right now, isn't it?
It is, and of course, getting the right people into the right positions in these international organisations is a crucial battle that goes on all the time. Eventually, of course, if you cheat too much and you get your people in to get what you want, eventually people will just withdraw from it. The Iranians are part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They've signed up to it, and therefore they could withdraw. You see, the Israelis aren't in it. The Israelis have absolutely refused to join the NPT. And the Iranians could just say, if the Israelis aren't in it, we're not in it either.
And they could maybe just leave. Yeah, anyway, we mentioned briefly the MH17 shoot down at the beginning, but I think we should have a look at this new documentary. Thanks for sending it to me, Martin. It's absolutely hot off the press. If the documentaries can be considered to come off presses, I think actually they come out of transmitter towers. They're supposed to, but they don't come out of British transmitter towers anymore, all these decent documentaries. I mean, it's worth saying, isn't it, Martin, that sometimes back in the day, you used to get some pretty controversial documentaries out there. Nowadays, something like this would never be shown on British television, certainly not for a good long while, because it's absolutely forensic, and it shows that the MH17 almost certainly wasn't shot down by the Russians, and actually there's been quite a sophisticated cover-up involved in who really did shoot it down.
Yes, indeed, and of course, it's pretty obvious from the get-go that there's something extremely suspicious about the whole thing, and it wasn't that the Russians had sent a missile battery across the border to shoot a plane down for the hell of it.
It's significant as well that, of course, it's a Dutch journalist that's decided to go and make this film. I mean, he speaks to people from all over the world, but the big change has been with the change in the Malaysian president, as he started to really speak out about this, saying it's just simply not on that Malaysia was shut out of the investigation.
Well, he's a rather significant figure because he's newly re-elected, but he ran Malaysia for quite a long time before that, and he's a very critical figure. The Malaysians are definitely not flavour of the month in the Western camp. They brought in exchange controls in 1998 when the economy collapsed, which the IMF told them not to, and they've also asked very big questions about 9/11 because it's a largely Muslim country.
It's interesting, isn't it, how the way that Singapore and Malaysia are both actually quite independent-minded states in Asia, and they seems to me to be, they will go with whatever seems to be the most sensible direction to go. They're not going to be bullied and pushed around by the West in the way that many other countries are.
Well, that's right. There's a multipolar world order gradually developing. And, of course, the Western powers, the British, the Americans, the Israelis, have got used to just giving the orders and everybody else going, yes, sir.
The Malaysians even put Bush and Blair on trial for war crimes in absentia, which means that neither of them can now, and they were found guilty, means neither of them can now travel to Malaysia, plus several senior Israeli politicians and military people also cannot travel to Malaysia because they've been tried in absentia.
Well, that's right. Well, that's one of the reasons why Malaysian plane was chosen for this provocation. If you're going to shoot a plane down, let's make it theirs. And, of course, why weren't they allowed into the investigation since it was their plane?
Anyway,
fascinating, isn't it?
The documentary is called MH17, A Call for Justice. Let's have a listen to a little clip now where they talk about some of the evidence, Martin, and this in a way is incredible, isn't it, that they would use phone tapping evidence in order to as part of the investigation, because, of course, with something like phone tapping evidence, you can have thousands and thousands of hours, and then you can choose X, Y, and Z little bits that suit
also,
you.
The phone tapping evidence came from the Ukrainian secret services, who are actually the main suspects.
In Malaysia, we found certified audio experts who prepare reports for court cases. They verify the authenticity of the phone taps for us.
This is left channel, right channel, they are just totally different. I can see there is a difference of the noise, and I also can see they are basically some kind of merging of an audio.
This is edited.
Yes, it's edited.
That's clear.
Yes.
How is it clear?
So look at the noise level, right? The noise level is different from this audio track. If you see this audio track, the noise level at this area, they're different. And this is lower, and this is higher.
Which means that this part of the conversation is compiled of different parts of different conversations.
Yes, it's a merging of different audio. Yes. These two are same sound. You can hear? So suddenly he added this particular word here, probably to hide something, to make the length. And here you can see so many cut. This is clear.
Oh, these are cuts. No?
Yeah, you can see missing audio. What is this conversation? It could be there's some conversation here. They just cut it, and then just leave the last part.
Yeah.
You can see that.
It looks the strangest.
Yeah.
Like,
you see.
So different.
Yeah. It clearly shows that these are two different recordings.
Okay. I cannot understand why must Ukraine involved with the investigation, but I do not know why Malaysia was not involved.
Yes, I do not know why Malaysia was not involved in it's incredible, isn't it, that a NATO country sympathetic to Ukraine can just take over the investigation, in this case Holland, the British taking possession of the black box and shut the Malaysians entirely out of their own inquiry.
Well, it's what they've not followed any kind of international procedure, and also, of course, they immediately decided that the Russians had done it and slapped sanctions on Russia, which have continued to this day with all kinds of ramifications. So why don't they? You'd say, well, why haven't you followed ordinary procedure here? And the reason they haven't followed ordinary procedure is the whole thing's a provocation, basically, a provocation by the Ukrainian security services, the SB, and their NATO allies.
What about these allegations that they're actually quite not just neo-Nazi, but actually pro-Nazi groups in Ukraine?
Well, there's no doubt.
Stefan Bandera, for example, being a Ukrainian Nazi that they revere. They have pictures of him up on their wall.
They're pretty obvious. They're pretty open about it. And of course, it's people like Paribi was in charge of the military on that day. They've got means, motive,
and
and
resigned,
opportunity.
didn't he?
But he's now Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, the Rada. But they've got means, motive, and opportunity. And if you say, "Oh, NATO would never shoot down a plane in in order to make the Russians look bad, I say you don't know what you're talking about. NATO has been carrying out provocations like this for years. They bombed Bologna railway station. They bombed Piazza Fontana in 1969. Yeah, this is the sort of thing they do. And they said they wouldn't kill innocent people to make a point, would they? And the answer is they would, and they have.
The documentary is called MH17, A Call for Justice. I'll put a link up to it on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. The journalist behind it, the Dutch journalist, is Max van der Werf.
If you're an EU citizen living in the UK, you will need to apply to the EU Settlement Scheme. The scheme is fully open and you have plenty of time to apply. It is free, and all you need is your passport or ID card and to complete an online form. Support is available if you have any questions. To find out more and to apply, visit gov.uk/EU Settlement Scheme. Irish citizens or those with valid indefinite leave don't need to apply.
Extraordinary story broke today, Martin. Farouk Orman, he will be released. He's a organised crime boss in Australia because his lawyer was a police informer, and the police have been trying to keep this quiet for a long, long time. Nicola Gobbo was his lawyer, but she was secretly working as an informer for the police. Surely it's really silly for the police to be having police informers as lawyers, because this, I mean, it was almost bound to happen eventually that this would come out.
Well, I don't know much about this case. It was the first time I've heard of it. And, of course, it's very difficult to fight organised crime.
They're all appealing their convictions now, all the people that this lawyer was working with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's, you know, if it turns out that that's the case, then they've just messed it up completely, haven't they? And that doesn't mean that the people concerned are innocent. It just means that the police have made a mess of it.
So, at the end of the day, how do you defeat organised crime? Because they needed someone, it looks like they needed someone who was trusted by some of these mafia people and some of the mafia lawyers to infiltrate the circle of lawyers in order to get information on who it was that they really needed to arrest. It almost seems as if it's impossible to arrest the mob. These organised criminals are so well organised that the police may well not bother.
Well, I'll give you two ways you're going to defeat organised crime. You've got to legalise drugs and you've got to disband the intelligence services.
That's a bit provocative. Legalise drugs, how is that going to help?
Well, because a lot of the power of organised crime has definitely come about since the CIA started running drugs out of China in the 1940s, and that's the drugs intelligence service network is absolutely, you know, that's what it's all about, really. I've just been reading stuff about Meyer Lansky, who was a big gangster in the US in the 1930s onwards, eventually went off to Israel. And, of course, what you do is these people are basically being protected. They're being protected by the intelligence services because the intelligence services use all the dirty money, which they can siphon off from this, to do all their sort of stuff, like arranging for planes to be blown up, etc., etc. That's the real world we live in. Now, we need honest coppers, but we also need sensible laws. You've got to legalise drugs so that we can control the drugs market, and you've also got to recognise that the intelligence services are criminals. They're both drug dealers and terrorists, as I'm quite sure people in, the Syrian army are absolutely completely well aware.
So Meyer Lansky, who was he? Was he involved in Hollywood, that sort of thing?
Well, he was involved in everything. I mean, he basically created Las Vegas. And, you know, Al Capone's a fairly low-level person. Meyer Lansky was, and Luciano and Lansky were probably the most serious organised criminals in the US in the 1930s and onwards. But, of course, Luciano was let out of prison so that he could help the Allies win the battle in Italy in the 1940s. And, of course, the quid pro quo was that the mafia were put in charge of southern Italy by the Allied forces as they went into Italy, which, of course, then led to the Gladio networks, which were then set up, and all the rest of it.
What about Meyer Lansky? Was he Jewish?
Jewish guy, yeah.
So you're anti-Semitic for calling him a criminal?
I don't suppose he was a particularly religious Jew, but he was Jewish.
But so you're anti-Semitic for calling him out as a criminal? Bugsy Siegel, his
right-hand man, was also Jewish. But Luciano was definitely...
Are you anti-Semitic?
No, I'm not. I deny it completely.
Well, what would you say? Because I mean, if you're
listen, if Jewish people do bad things, are we not allowed to say that they've done bad things because they're Jewish? That's absurd.
Well,
yeah, we've got to judge people by their behaviour, not by their ethnic origin.
You're moving seamlessly, beautifully, segueing into our next story, which is about my YouTube channel being censored. I was particularly irritated because we did what I thought was a terrific show. I would say that, wouldn't I? Last year with Richard Gage and Ian Henshaw, and YouTube have decided that it's anti-Semitic hate speech.
At one stage, I looked at how many people had looked at it. We had 30,000 people had looked at that or listened to that show. How many hits did it die with? Do we know?
No, because they just cut it off.
So we don't know.
And I put a little appeal saying, well, there's nothing anti-Semitic in here. This is just criticism of certain... I mean, actually, most of it is anything to do with Israel, but there's certain aspects of it which link to Israel.
Yeah.
It's a forensic thing. It's not anti-Jewish. They just decided, your appeal, we've just dismissed it. We're not interested in that.
You can...
So it actually says now, if you try and go up onto YouTube and view it, it says this has been removed due to hate speech.
Well, isn't it interesting that it wasn't hate speech for quite a long time, and then suddenly it is? And you know what that is? It's because basically it's beginning...
There is no, by the way, explanation by YouTube whatsoever as to what specific part of that video they have decided to take the whole thing down.
Well, presumably they've had their
violates our community guidelines, and we're not going to say where or how. And now you have to appeal.
Well, as you know, Ofcom, the UK Lawyers for Israel had a complaint about this show, which was knocked back by Ofcom,
which was proved to be the Israeli Foreign Ministry, actually.
Well, yes, but I think what's happened is they've gone around, they've looked at other things we've done, and so they've found another way to try and close us down, which is to go to YouTube and say, well, this is hate speech, take it down. And of course, YouTube basically are either in their pocket or under their pressure. But I think it's very interesting when something like this is taken.
This is Google, by the way, who've just announced record profits.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very interesting when something like this happens, when a show like that is taken down, it's a pretty clear indication of what they don't want you to hear. And anybody listening to this show now should get a copy of that show, which is out there, and they can get a copy of it, and then you listen to it, and you make up your own mind what you think.
Yeah, I mean, it does actually make me feel pretty horrible when you put all this time and effort into something, and then they do that and accuse you again of something which is actually libelous, saying that we're doing hate speech here, which we're not. What I've decided to do is to start putting these onto the Russian version of Facebook, vk.com.
Yeah.
What you can then do is just leave it there, and they have what seems to be a much more robust system for whether something's going to be taken down. So my video's up on vk.com now, and any future ones that get removed, I shall be putting them up on there. Well, and this is the company which Snowden started working for when he went to Russia.
Yeah, well, I mean, the answer to this, if Google and Facebook and all these other Western-oriented tech companies are very much in the pocket of the intelligence services in the West, carry on censoring things, then we just smash their business model by not putting our stuff up on there, put it up somewhere else.
Yep. Good idea. And what you said earlier was absolutely right about things being there for a long time and then suddenly being taken down. One of the things I found so fascinating was one of my interviews that I put up there was actually just a clip of I thought was quite a good, intense, short section of a long interview by Chris Bollin back in 2015. And he decided to go through some of the people he thought may have been responsible for the 9/11 attacks, many of whom were Israelis. And it's not anti-Semitic. I mean, how can you say it's not? It's not. He's just presenting evidence that in one way or another...
Which may or may not be correct.
Yes, in one way or another, that they're linked with either with the attacks themselves or with the sorts of films and things like that which were presaging. And here he is, and this is one of the bits that YouTube took down this week, where he talks about a chap called, I can't remember his name now, but anyway, he was an Israeli film director over in Hollywood who did films which were very sort of like planes crashing into buildings and this sort of thing. And anyway, this is what Chris Bollin had to say.
Okay, here's another guy. This man here in the middle is Arnon Milchan. He is Israel's main Mossad agent in Hollywood. He's also the senior agent of Lechem. Lechem was a super secret Israeli operation to get American nuclear technology to Israel for their nuclear program. It was started by Shimon Peres, and Shimon Peres and this guy are best friends. Well, this guy came to Hollywood, and these are basically his property. These people make movies. This is Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. And he makes movies in which these people are star. And he made movies like JFK, in which, of course, who's the guilty party? Some nebulous group at the CIA. He made Brazil, another movie where bombs go off all the time without making any sense. A futuristic film. Bombs go off here, bombs go off there. Terrorism is a fact of life. Very much like Iraq has become. Like Iraq has been for the last 10, 13 years. Bombs go off here, bombs go off at funerals, bombs go off in restaurants. Here he is with two of his big friends, Shimon Peres, who he calls his best friend, and Bibi Netanyahu. He made a movie in 1978 in England, France and England, called The Medusa Touch. And in this movie, the climactic scene is a 747 flying into the Pan Am building. And this is how they're arranging the props to make this scene possible for their movie. Here's the book. Peter Van Greenway, don't let the name fool you. This man is actually a Jewish writer. The publisher is a Jewish publisher. And as we know, the man who made the movie is a Mossad agent. And Richard Burton, I haven't watched the movie too closely myself, but my friend down in Seguin watched it the other night, and he said that the symbolism in this movie is very interesting. He said, I'm dying to watch it now that he's told me about this, but it's a lot of anti-Christian symbolism in the movie. But Richard Burton says, I am the man with the power to create catastrophe. Because Richard Burton has this sort of telekinesis power where he imagines something happening and it happens. And churches get blown up, and buildings get blown up, and planes fly into buildings. This is 1978 he made this movie. Then he was involved in another movie he made in 2000 in Vancouver, Canada, and in New York City, in which a plane here flies into the World Trade Center. And in the movie, this plane has a passenger flight which has been remotely hijacked by superior computer technology. And then the plane narrowly, here they're pulling up, and the plane just narrowly misses the World Trade Center. He made this movie, The Lone Gunman. It's a pilot episode of a series by the same title. And in this he made with Rupert Murdoch, because Rupert Murdoch and Arnon Milchan were partners in their TV production company called New Regency. So you ask yourself, well, which writer had the brilliant idea to fly planes in the World Trade Center? And to make this scene, they actually flew helicopters along the flight path of the plane.
So predictive programming is what they call it, but it's the idea that fiction can sometimes imitate reality in reverse order.
Well, I think the important thing that people need to get here is that this guy admitted that he was a Mossad agent. So when Chris Billin says that he's a Mossad agent, the guy actually boasted about being a Mossad agent. He said, yes, I've been a Mossad agent for
actually,
years.
Haaretz has got an article about him, a quite recent one, actually, from February last year. The Israeli James Bond, they call him, Arnon Milchan, and his ties to the Secret Services. The movie mogul at the centre of a corruption case involving Prime Minister Netanyahu has led the kind of life he often shows on the big screen. Arnon Milchan, a key figure in corruption case threatening Netanyahu, which seems to have been forgotten about now, is best known as the producer of such Hollywood blockbusters as Pretty Woman and LA Confidential. I mean, these are extremely powerful people in the cultural industries, aren't they?
All right, well, let's try and cut to the chase here. Something like the 9/11 attack is planned long in advance. It's not dissimilar to the Operation Northwoods plan in the early 60s, where planes were going to be blown up and there's going to be a big casualty list, and it was going to be blamed on Cuba, and the Americans were going to blame Cuba. Now, people shouldn't just presume that the Israelis are the only culprits on 9/11. They're not. They definitely got allies inside the Western deep state. They don't operate on their own. But of course, they've got a long-term agenda, and they basically they use their control of mass media to create suggestions in people's minds about what can and can't happen. So Brazil, for example, very interesting film, but of course it's basically putting, they're playing games with people's minds so that when the incident does happen, people have already been pre-programmed to think that something like that might happen.
Let's focus on Milchan himself, Martin, because more has been revealed since even then. And this is back last year. Police recommended in Israel that Milchan be indicted on bribery charges for showering Netanyahu and his wife Sarah with lavish gifts, allegedly in exchange for help in various pursuits that required the Prime Minister's political clout. According to the police, Netanyahu received $1 million shekels, about $250,000 worth of champagne, cigars, jewellery and clothing on demand and systematically from Milchan and Australian billionaire James Packer. Milchan was the key supplier, though, supplying about 3/4 of the gifts, the Israeli police are saying. In an interview broadcast on Israeli television, Milchan confirmed long-standing speculation he had worked as an agent for Israel's clandestine security service for many years, purchasing arms for the country and insisting on the development of nuclear capabilities the foreign media attribute to Israel. The state has never confirmed or denied any of Milchan's claims.
Well,
but, I mean, he's a legitimate person to investigate, for goodness sake. The Israeli police are investigating.
Of course he is. And, of course, Epstein, who's, popping in and out of the news, he has got very strong links to the Israeli intelligence services as well.
What do you make of that, anyway, that Epstein case?
Well, what you've got to recognise is that we were talking about Meyer Lansky earlier. The link between organised crime, which is dominated, for example, in Russia by people of Jewish origin, it just is, and the intelligence services of the Israelis in particular, but also the other Western intelligence services, this is where all of this stuff comes together. This is what you're up against. It's intelligence services, right-wing extremists, and organised crime, which is involved in sex and drugs trafficking.
OK, so I'll put some links up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk to those censored films, now uploaded onto vk.com, and I put them up on briefly on Facebook as well. Maybe that wasn't the most sensible place to put them. I mean, you do feel, Martin, that some of these tech giants are actually now really hostile to the truth. For a long time, they have been able to capture a lot of the thoughts and sentiments of people who are disillusioned by the mainstream media, the very controlled mass media. They've all been moving over to social media because people can share that a lot more easily. Now they're clamping down and they're starting to say, well, if you're going to criticise Israel, that's hate speech.
Well, that's right. But, of course, but what I would say that it's like a game of chess. What you're doing by closing down that particular show, for example, is you're putting a red light on it. This is what you need to know, folks. This is what you need to listen to, because that's why they don't want you to hear it.
Also, the Miami show band massacre. This came up in the news a few weeks ago. We didn't cover it then, but I think it would be also, since we've had a listen to the soundtrack from the MH17 documentary earlier, have a little listen to that. But before we do, Martin, this Miami show band massacre was one of the most horrific things that happened during the Northern Ireland Troubles, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the Miami show band were basically a show band. They used to go around playing gigs in rural and small towns in Ireland, and they were pulled over to the side
country music, was it?
Well, it's all sorts of things. Yeah, it's what they call Cayley band music, as far as I know. I've never been a great fan of it.
Okay, so were they from the Republic or from the North?
I'm not quite sure, but the thing is, they all got killed at a roadblock run by, I think, the UDA. But of course, the suggestion was that it's actually being run by the intelligence services.
So who is the UDA?
The Ulster Defence Association was set up at the beginning of the Troubles, really. The UVF already existed. And, of course, the first bomb planted during the Troubles was the UVF bomb of a transmitter, which was blamed on the IRA, even though the UVF had done it. Now, of course, what you've got in Northern Ireland is on a small scale.
These were loyalist terrorists.
These are loyalist terrorists. Yeah. What you've got in Northern Ireland is on a smaller scale, the same kind of manipulation and skullduggery that goes on a bigger scale in things like 9/11.
So let's have a listen now to a clip from that. Again, not the BBC. This is Netflix only.
The Miami Showband was Ireland's most glamorous band.
They were our superstars.
The Irish Beatles. We all lived in the Republic. But we were an extremely popular band in Northern Ireland.
At that time, the conflict in Ireland was raging.
We were dealing with a huge level of violence.
Terrorism by the paramilitary groups escalated. I bought into this idea that musicians were immune.
There was shooting, there was screaming. It was like an absolute war zone.
I didn't accept that they were dead. I thought somehow or other this was just a bad dream.
The intention clearly was the bomb would kill all of them.
Questions were being raised.
And quite clearly it was an inside job.
They had to find out how far up this went. They murdered my friends. They left me for dead. They tried to frame me and my entire family as terrorists.
The report went up the chain of command.
and then, poof, nothing happened.
It's been over 40 years, but we're finally getting closer to the truth.
Well, of course, the point about this is it's not just the loyalist paramilitaries, that it was actually orchestrated by the intelligence services, those criminals that we've been pointing the finger at in this whole show.
In this case, we're talking about who? Because MI5, actually, they weren't involved through the whole of the Troubles period, were they? As I understand it, it was Army intelligence, and then the MI5.
Well, you've got a whole smorgasbord,
special branch for.
You've got a whole smorgasbord
police.
of different people. Of course, the Loughin Island massacre film that's just been, there's been all the fuss about that. That was RUC. That was the RUC protecting the loyalists. In this occasion, the Glenane gang that carried out the 1972 Dublin and Monaghan massacres killed 27 people, injured hundreds.
That was in the south?
That was at Dublin and Monaghan, yeah. Both in the south. The Glenane gang have never been questioned about any of it, and the Irish police are pretty much convinced that they got the explosives and the whole idea for the attacks from MI5. Now, you've got to remember that the British state has got various, you've got RUC Special Branch, you've got MI5, you've got MI6, you've got Army Intelligence, you've got the Force Research Unit, you've got the 14th Det and all the rest of it. They're all putting their finger in and stirring the pot. And, of course, most of what people think they know about what happened during the war in Ireland is simply wrong. Lots of things went on which most people who live in comfortable circumstances don't realise. And, of course, it's a microcosm of what's going on in the wider world.
So why have we got to find out about what really happened at the Miami Showband massacre? Why have we got to go to Netflix to find that out?
Well, because, as you will know, there is an enormous amount of manipulation by the mainstream media. Certain things don't get talked about at all, and other things get rammed down your throat.
This is decades ago, though.
The point about history, Tony, is that if people started to get the idea of what the state is capable of, then when the next bomb goes off, they think, hang on a minute, I don't quite believe the story you're telling me here. That's why this history is so important.
And now the government are talking about quite what Boris's attitude is going to be to this, about allowing or stopping any kind of investigations into army practices during the Troubles.
Well, that's because they don't want all this can of worms to be opened.
We even had, Karen Bradley, the former Northern Ireland Secretary, saying, oh, well, if it was done by the army, then it's above the law.
Well, the most important part of this is we're not talking about shooting the odd person in a roadblock, is that the British Army's Force Research Unit, led by Brigadier Gordon Kerr and John Ware, who's just done this hit job on Jeremy Corbyn for Panorama.
A hatchet job, yeah.
Yeah, but he did a very good job of exposing Brigadier Gordon Kerr. And Brigadier Gordon Kerr was basically in charge of the Loyalist paramilitary campaign. So everybody killed by the Loyalists, and there were hundreds of them, the British Army were directly responsible for that, and they should have been sent to prison. But they weren't sent to prison, they were given a medal and a pat on the back.
We seem to be talking quite a lot about censorship this week. Twitter has also suspended Iran's news agencies over harassment of the Baha'is. So that's one reason to do it. I wonder if that's the main reason. Young Journalist Club YJC, run by state broadcaster IRIB, state-run INRA, and Mehr News Agency were among the Farsi language accounts which were suspended last Saturday by Twitter. Some agencies, including Fars Agency and English Language Press TV, have remained active, though, on Twitter. The affected agencies speculated the suspensions were linked to their coverage of tensions in the region. In particular, they believed they were being penalised for their reporting of Iran's seizure of the British flag tanker in the Gulf on Friday. So the thing is with these kind of suspensions by Twitter is they just say, sorry, your account is suspended, and no one really knows why. But we can guess it's to do with that, not the Baha'i faith.
Well, I think you're probably right. And I think why we're getting an awful lot more censorship than we had, say, a year ago, 2 years ago, is because we're that much closer to war. And, of course, in wartime, then the truth is very much the first casualty.
What about the comparison, then, between the protests in France and those in Hong Kong? Because this is a brilliant article. I thought I'd have a look onto Fars News Agency. I'm not sure. Is it the Iranian? Yes, it is. And they're saying, well, isn't it interesting the way that we report the French protests and the way we report the Hong Kong protests? We've just heard today that the main airport has been almost, well, not quite closed down, but certainly the protests are right inside the airport in Hong Kong now. And that is seen to be, people upholding democracy, whereas in France, it's a whole bunch of troublemakers causing civil unrest.
Well, that's right. It's the double standards of everything that's extraordinary, isn't it? When people in countries we don't like protest, they're regarded as heroes, even though in Iran, for example, they burned down a police station and all the rest of it. But if we burned down a police station here, we'd be anarchists and sent to prison for 25 years. But there you go. There's no truth, there's no justice, just us.
The German... OK, so this is another story which I found fascinating this week. The anti-vaccination sentiment is backed by the populist movement. That is a story on CNN. They're saying that parents in Germany who fail to vaccinate their children will now face hefty fines after the German government backed a bill requiring all children to receive measles, mumps jab, etc., before entering schools or kindergartens. So we're talking now, this is a little bit like the state taking over our kids. It's rather like saying that if you want to take your children on holiday, then you have to pay a fine. Now, if you don't want your children vaccinated, you also have to pay a fine in Germany.
Well, I mean, there are legitimate arguments about all of these things, Tony, but the question is censorship ever legitimate? You may not agree with what people say, but shutting them up doesn't stop them thinking it. It just makes the whole debate that much weaker.
At the end of the day, whose are the children? Are they yours or the state's when it comes to school, taking them to school or not, or getting vaccinated
this is a totally different topic from censorship.
It is, I know.
All right, well, that's okay. Well, let's move on then.
Yeah,
I would argue as somebody who works with children that children have independent rights, independent of their parents and the state. That doesn't mean that the state or the parents don't have some rights as well, but the rights of the children, and it's all enshrined in UN charters.
I mean, I've covered on this programme, Martin,
I've
covered on this programme falsifying of documents to do with, particularly to do with the Infanrix Hexa vaccine, which is supposed to be given to infants, and the falsifying of data, which actually, when you have a good look at it, shows that this is actually harming more children than it helps. It's 5 different things in one, apparently. Anyway, I'll put a link up to that on our show page. Time to sign off for the US-owned Comcast News at 8 now. We're on thisweek.org.uk, where you can comment or complain, whatever you like. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling. Have a relaxing and enjoyable BCfm weekend. Our sister show Dialects here on Tuesday at noon. Do please join us for the Politics Show, though, at 6 o'clock next week. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.
National news on the hour. Live from the Sky News Centre.
From the Sky News Centre at 7, 2 pro-Brexit campaigners have admitted harassing Remain-supporting MP Anna Soubry.
Scum! 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 Shame! Shame! Shame on you! Shame! Shame! Shame on you!
She was interrupted by shouts during a TV interview in January and was called a Nazi. 30-year-old James Goddard from Altrincham, who filmed himself hurling abuse at the then Tory MP, also admitted a racially aggravated public order offence against a police officer. Hertfordshire police deny having prior warning of a car cruise event in Stevenage where 17 people were injured. 2 vehicles crashed last night. Future meetups have been cancelled. Leaked emails have emerged suggesting Jeremy Corbyn's chief of staff was looking at ways to challenge the decisions of the party's highest disciplinary body. They were sent when the NCC was due to hear cases of anti-Semitism last year. Donald Trump says he's looking forward to working with Boris Johnson. The former London mayor hasn't won the race to be the next Prime Minister yet, but is the clear favourite. BBC and ITV have revealed more details about their new joint subscription service, including the price. BritBox will cost $5.99 a month and include archive programmes as well as fresh content. ITV's chief executive Carolyn McCall says it seemed an obvious thing to do. She described the rivalry between the two broadcasters as old.
The competition is all around us. The whole way of media and media consumption is changing, and we have to respond to that. And I think this is one of our ways of responding.
And Ireland's Shane Lowry and America's JB Holmes share the lead at the Open Golf Championship. They both sit at 8 under par after the opening 2 rounds. English duo Lee Westwood and Tommy Fleetwood are also in contention. They're a shot back on 7 under par. Home favourite Rory McIlroy looks set to miss the cut. He's 4 over par with 5 5 holes left to play. That's the latest. I'm
There's
Anna
an
Bates.
impressive lineup for 2019 at Valley Fest, with a DJ set from Basement Jaxx, then Razorlight and Tom Odell live. And that's not all. DJ sets from Norman J, MBE and Left Field, alongside Nubian Twist, Honeyfeet and many more will keep you entertained in the most beautiful Chew Valley Lake setting. Food-wise, Michelin-starred Josh Eggleton and Rob Howell are at the helm on Saturday, serving a 6-course feast during the afternoon and evening. There'll be food demos from Caribasian Cookery, and the Year Valley team will be there alongside talks and treats for the whole family. Valley Fest takes place between Friday the 2nd and Sunday the 4th of August this year, and tickets are selling fast. Visit valleyfest.co.uk or check BCfm radio socials for details. Valley Fest 2019, the best tasting music festival in the Southwest.
Every weekday, getting Bristol home on BCfm 93.2. Online, on digital, on smart speaker, on app, and all over Bristol on 93.2 FM. Your one-stop shop for news, travel, information, local stories, weather, what's on, gig guides, plenty of music. Getting Bristol home. Getting Bristol home. Getting Bristol home. 4 till 7 p.m. and Fridays at 3.
BCfm. Celebrating diversity. This is Bristol's BCfm 93.2.
Good morning, wake up, WC on the radio. Just wonderful to be with you. And just checking out some celebrity gossip and some of your letters for Waity's Mail. Good morning and hello, WC on the radio. And just got to check through some of the celebrity stories and the gossip. We see here that, well, I was reading a review of a brand new film about the life of Jerry Lee Lewis, and it's called Great Balls of Fire. And I said, the guy said that he wasn't too hot on the film. He said that they left out the bit about Tim Witt. What's that? Sorry, my producer's interrupting here. What? Pedophile. Okay, well, apparently, yeah, he had a great big collection of information about feet.
Disgrace, and it is a public scandal.
Welcome back to BCFM's Politics Show with Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers and me, Tony Gosling. Was it really only February the 1st this year, the time of Trump's 2019 State of the Union address, that the US pulled out of the INF Treaty? Well, that's intermediate nuclear forces to you and I. There's a 6-month period of grace which is about to expire, with neither side admitting fault. So tonight we ask, just who really violated the treaty, bringing us closer to a nuclear war in Europe between NATO and Russia? And what does a tactical nuclear arms race look like for us mere mortals who are forced to pay for it? Plus the good old Straits of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. What's the US Navy doing there so far from home? And are the BBC reporting what's going on accurately? Plus a leading US Jew on the Labour anti-Semitism scandal and the very real historical ties between the Zionist Israel lobby and the Nazis. He argues the row between rival Jewish factions in the Labour Party mirrors similar inter-Jewish disagreements in 1930s America in the run-up to World War II. Plus, Catherine Austin Fitz on the future of money and why we should all be concerned when we're being herded. Using the word herded because we all need the stuff. Money, that is, but nobody's being asked about the huge changes to the way we manage and spend it. Our sister show Dialects here on BCfm on Tuesday at noon. This week, the first of a two-part series on the Glastonbury Abbey sphere of influence. We travel to Shapwick House, the site of the arrest of Abbot Whiting in September 1539. He was subsequently executed on the Tor, right at the very end of the dissolution of the monasteries. And Mark Hutchinson and Luke Loader from the Abbey's Education Office look at the role of this massive medieval institution's almoner, whose job, a bit like the job centres today, was to distribute a good deal of the wealth of the Abbey to the poor. You can listen here at BCfm 93.2 at noon next Tuesday, or download it right now from dialectradio.co.uk. But we start right now, Martin, by picking up somewhere where we left off right at the end of the first hour there, which is looking at this old men at the zoo. The idea of a Middle East war has been reflected in our culture in the 1960s and 1970s quite a lot, actually, hasn't it? I seem to remember films talking about when are the Americans going to invade the Middle East, even back in the 1970s. It's not as if this is all new, having a big, powerful US presence in the Middle East, is it?
Well, no, I mean, it's the most likely region for a world war to start, and
why?
Because it's where the tectonic plates of geopolitics rub up against each other. It's not. There's other places that are.
I mean, isn't it? I mean, what you're saying there is it's Africa, Europe, and Asia, and it's where all three meet and cross over.
Well, it's more to do with where the limits of US power rub up against the Iranians, the Russians, etc. And and the state of Israel, of course, is a continuous provocation. And engages in provocation in the region. They carry on bombing Syria, even though the Syrians have not retaliated in any way, apart from shooting down things that are being fired at them. And the potential, the Straits of Hormuz for some accidental miscalculation leading to a conflagration is very, very real.
What's the US Navy doing in the Straits of Hormuz? It doesn't really need to be there, or does it?
Well, I mean, the US has always taken the position that they've got a right to intervene in the Persian Gulf because it's so important for the world economy that the oil flows from the Persian Gulf, and therefore they feel that they've got the right to stick their finger in. And as we know, they're talking about putting ships there to protect against Iranian interdiction. But of course, the Persian Gulf is called the Persian Gulf for a reason. It's because it's Iran's English Channel, if you like, and it's all their territorial waters.
I suppose the comparison, I made it last week, didn't I? The idea that you might get, Iranian gunboats or battleships sort of going up and down the Thames or the Bristol Channel. That's what we're looking at here.
Well, that's right. The Iranians are saying, look, this is our part of the world. We haven't got Iranian battleships off New York Harbour, have we? It's you're the ones who say. Of course, the thing is, that it's a death trap. If it comes to a fight, every NATO vessel inside the Persian Gulf will be sunk almost immediately. And therefore, what they need to do is have them out in the Indian Ocean so they can have they can attack from long distance. And if they're actually inside the Gulf when the balloon goes up, all those people are as good as dead straight away.
Anyway, Angus Wilson's book from 1961, Old Men at the Zoo, it was translated in another. I mean, it's a BBC a million miles away from today's BBC drama in 1983, a series called The Old Men at the Zoo, which had been updated by Troy Kennedy Martin with the backing of Angus Wilson, with some of the new things brought in to do with nuclear war in the Middle East and that sort of thing. But anyway, what this does, this drama, Martin, and maybe you can comment on why we don't see this sort of thing happening nowadays, and I'll put some links up to the versions of it online. The BBC don't sell it for some reason as a DVD, because it blends together this idea of fascist takeover in Britain at the same time as a Middle Eastern war breaking out.
Well, I mean, this is obviously a work of fiction, but nevertheless, the kind of topics that it's covering are very much to the point in the world that we live in,
what Angus teases out in this drama is a secret obsession of the natural history bigwigs and zoo owners with eugenics, and the idea that an admiration for physical strength over intellectual strength, which he found absolutely abhorrent, and he found it rife, or he believed it was rife within the sort of natural history profession.
Well, look, I don't know the particular piece of work that you're referring to, so I can't really comment.
All right. Well, what I'll do is I'll just simply put a link up on our show page, and I think it's fascinating that the fascist takeover in Britain as a Middle Eastern war threatens Europe. It's all kind of got some of these interesting parallels with today. The animals moved out of London to a safe location, and punks and other young protesters, like the Extinction Rebellion people, I imagine, locked up in a London zoo, almost like in a menagerie. So let's have a little listen now to an extract from that.
You're never going to have a war. We're all likely to get blown up.
Is it that bad?
The Arabs won't back down, and the Europeans, well, you know what the French are like. The chances of them blowing each other to smithereens are very high, and of course, once they're in, we are. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't like the idea of my wife and 2 children dying in a nuclear firestorm. No.
Sugar?
No.
But it's on the cards, you know, sometime in the autumn.
Lord God Manchester, I am not one of your employees. I am a public servant employed by the Royal Zoological Society.
Rubbish. I run the zoo with the aid of the monarch. I'm going to take you into my confidence. As you're no doubt aware, for some time I've been mounting a campaign to get myself back into office. However, the situation is so grave that the country may have to forego the luxury of an election and accept a coalition government. The situation is so bad, it needs someone like me to get them out of trouble. I'm telling you all this because I'm going to be very busy from now on. I'm going to leave the affairs of the zoo in your hands. Yes?
We've got Wallbanger on Channel 4.
Oh, excuse me.
First, the Arabs do not have the capability to deliver a nuclear bomb, even if they had one. And secondly, I think once we step out of the conflict, you guys are more likely to come to terms. Thank you.
General Wallbanger has now left for an undisclosed destination.
He's wrong on both counts. The Arabs have the bomb, are not able to deliver it. I don't think we should reach a settlement without American help.
Well, that's an extract from the 1983 BBC drama, The Old Men at the Zoo there. But Martin, there is this aspect to it all, which is, there was actually, one of the influences on that drama, and let's point out this is not fact, this is just drama, from 1983, a very different BBC now, was that this sort of thing could actually happen, a Middle Eastern war.
Well, we've had, that was in 1983, and we've had several wars in the Middle East since then.
And also the coup aspect.
Including the Iran-Iraq war, the invasion of Iraq.
But this is in the wake.
The invasion of Iraq.
Martin, this is the wake of the 70s. There actually was a coup attempt in Britain.
Yes, there was, because the Labour government at the time had fallen foul of the pro-American deep state here, and Wilson. There's a BBC Two drama documentary about it with James Bolan playing Wilson, and it's all based on Penrose and Courtier, the British BBC journalists that were brought into Wilson's confidence about the coup attempt,
and then booted out of the BBC. Yes, for their trouble. The book is, by the way,
the possibility of a pro-NATO coup in this country is definitely there.
The book is called The Pencourt Files, or Pencourt File. Fascinating read. I read about 20 years ago or something, and you couldn't. I mean, as you say, that's also
there's a British Army general who's on the record as saying that if Corbyn comes to power, the army will remove him. They've said that.
Is he retired or serving?
No, he was a serving officer, but they refused to identify him. But if he could be identified, he should, of course, be sacked and lose his pension.
That could just be the Times hearsay, couldn't it?
Well, he went on the record in the Times without giving his name and said that Corbyn wouldn't be allowed to be Prime Minister. The army would never stand for it. Now, in actual fact, that's treason, and he should probably be prosecuted. Never mind lose his job. But of course, we're too wishy-washy, really. We ought to take the gloves off and give those people a bloody nose.
So, getting back to this sort of conflict with the Arabs and the possibility of Iran having a nuclear weapon at some point, the almost unspoken truth.
The Iranians aren't Arabs, but yes.
All right, so yes, but the unspoken nuclear weapons of Israel, which are not even officially declared. What do you make of that?
Well, they're not officially declared because under the Logan Act, which is a US congressional act, any country that proliferates nuclear weapons has to be put under complete sanctions, and that's why the Israelis won't admit they've got nuclear weapons, because that would bring the Logan Act would kick in, and the US would be forced to put sanctions.
So what do you make this week of these claims by the Americans that they've shot down an Iranian drone, but then the Iranians saying, well, we have definitely not lost a drone today?
Well, I think what that's about is Trump basically lost face when the Iranians shot down his drone, and therefore he's pretending that he shot down one of theirs.
This is schoolboy stuff.
Well, it is, yes, but it's also
actually less. It's nursery type stuff.
It's nursery type stuff with 21st century weapons, which could end up in lots of people being incinerated.
What's the fact of the matter? What do you think?
I think they're making it up. I think the Iranians basically. I don't think the Iranian drone was shot down. I think the Americans are making it up, but I've got no proof of that. I just don't believe a word they say about anything.
Let's have a listen now to an analysis by the BBC's Frank Gardner on the Iran tensions and the supposed shoot down of this Iranian drone this week.
We are in a kind of weird twilight zone at the moment where there isn't open conflict between Iran and the US, but there are these incidents which slowly ratchet up tension, matched by a slow incremental increase in the US stationing planes and forces in the Gulf. We're not talking here about any kind of build-up to an invasion of Iran. No one is talking about that. This isn't Iraq in 2003. At the same time, in parallel, you've got diplomats, including Gulf diplomats, who are trying to find a way around this, some kind of escape route for an escape valve for the steam that is building up here. And yes, the talk of increased inspections is one aspect of that. That would run contrary, though, to what the hawks in Washington, specifically John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, are trying to do. They want to really put so much pressure on Iran, particularly on its economy, that it comes begging back for a new deal, which includes reducing their missile capability and curtailing the activities of their militias around the region. The hardliners in Iran aren't going to go for that.
Well, that's pretty obvious stuff. They want a war with Iran. The Israelis have been banging on about it for ages and ages and ages. But if they're going to have a war, they've got to move all the military into position.
But what's in it for the United States? I can see the advantage to Israel, but not for the US.
The United States wants to be full spectrum dominance. They don't want any countries outside their control, and that includes. And Iran's a very important country, and it's aligned with the US's supposed enemies, China and Russia. And they want to, they basically want to they want regime change in all three countries. They're not going to get it because they're not strong enough. But by pushing for it, they may precipitate a world war, which will kill a lot of people, including possibly the people in this room.
When the US Congresswoman Ilhan Omar calls Trump a fascist, is she correct in that? I mean, this whole idea of having world domination...
Well, I mean, the word fascist gets bandied around.
This whole idea of world domination is for the birds, surely.
Well, it's not, because the US... dominates the international financial system. Basically, countries have to pay tribute to the US through the international debt and so on. Wall Street dominates the planet. But, of course, it hasn't got complete domination because the Russians are militarily outside of their control and the Chinese are economically outside of their control. And, of course, they're working together to create a new multipolar world order in which, Central Asia will become predominant.
Surely this quest for world domination is doomed to fail. It can't succeed.
You would think
the closer the closer they get to it, the less likely it is to happen because the other big power blocks are going to get together and stop it.
What we should be doing is everybody should be talking to everybody else about solving our mutual problems on this speck of dust floating around in the middle of nowhere. We were talking about the space race earlier. Really, there's no reason why Russian, Chinese, American and Europeans couldn't get together and create a more balanced setup with a win-win for everybody.
Anyway.
But of course the dominant forces, oligarchy in the West, won't accept that.
Anyway, this week the BBC's Hard Talk did an excellent interview, I thought. Anyway, it's good to see, with Javad Zarif. He's the Iranian foreign minister, and here he talks about what's happening with the Iran nuclear deal, otherwise known as the JCPOA, and nuclear weapons over in Iran and potential of them.
This deal was written based on total mistrust. Neither side trusted the other side. That is why we put everything in black and white. Very clearly stated that if we don't comply, what they can take, if we are the initial breakers of the deal, they can take measures. If they are the initial breakers of the deal, they can also take measures.
So you've got to allay fears, haven't you, Foreign Minister? The Iranians, according to the British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt, he has said this week that Iran is a year away from developing a nuclear bomb.
If Iran wanted to build a bomb, we would have built the bomb a long time ago. We could have built the bomb a long time ago. We do not want to build a bomb because we believe that a nuclear bomb will not augment our security. But if the Europeans are serious about a nuclear weapons-free Middle East, there is somewhere else that they need to be looking, and that's Israel, where they have at least 200 nuclear warheads.
President Trump said quite recently that he was 10 minutes away from war with Iran over the shooting down of the unmanned US drone over what America says was international waters, and the French President Emmanuel Macron agrees with that. You say no, it was over Iranian waters and so on. But do you accept that the US doesn't want war?
I accept that President Trump doesn't want war, but I know that there are people in his administration who are crazy for war, who thirst for war.
John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, who...
I don't think I need to mention him. President Trump himself has mentioned it.
How do you assess the possibility, the likelihood of some kind of military engagement between Iran and America?
You see, it's called Persian Gulf for a reason. It's next to our coast. We have almost 1,500 miles of coast with Persian Gulf. It's not the Gulf of Mexico. We're there, we're protecting our territorial waters, and if this drone had been shot in international waters, over international airspace, why did we got to pick up the pieces?
Well, I mean, we don't often get to hear the Iranian point of view, do we? And when we do hear it, it just sounds like common sense. Meanwhile, we're just subjected to lots of bluster, and of course Britain is now being dragged into a confrontation with the Iranians because of the seizure of this tanker in the Mediterranean. And that's basically just we're being used as America's bitch here, basically.
Hard Talk also talked to, as Zainab Badawi, talking to Javad Zarif about economic warfare.
President Trump has said that I am not engaged in military war against Iran, I'm engaged in economic war against Iran. What does it mean to be engaged in economic war? Economic war targets civilians. Military war targets military personnel. Civilians are sometimes collateral damage. But an economic war targets civilians. The United States Secretary Pompeo has said that we want the Iranian people to change their government. So putting these two together, that means that the United States is terrorizing Iranian people in order to achieve political objectives. That's the classical definition of terrorism.
The Americans have said consistently, and Mike Pompeo is their goal is not regime change. He says we want to change Iran's behaviour so it behaves like a normal country.
Mike Pompeo,
that's what he has said.
Iran is a normal country. The country that is not normal is the United States. Right. Which normal country violates every international agreement? INF, NAFTA, the Paris Climate Convention, UNESCO, Human Rights Council. Is that what you call normal?
Let me put to you, though, you've said your country is suffering from the sanctions. When you give organisations like Hezbollah hundreds of millions of dollars a year,
who said we give them hundreds of millions?
Well, that's what Mike Pompeo said.
Keep
the money for your people.
Mike Pompeo may like to make statements. Right. You see, Mike Pompeo's allies in our region, Saudi Arabia, spend $67 billion a year on military equipment. They are bombing the Yemenis. Are we doing that? We only spent $16 billion last year on entire military budget.
Well, the Iranians are quite right there. I mean, they have a military budget because they're being threatened. And they're being threatened by the Israelis with nuclear weapons. They're being threatened by the Americans. They're being threatened by the British. Therefore, they have to spend some money on defence, including supplying stuff to their allies, just as we spend loads of money helping the Saudis to kill Yemeni children, because it's in our national interest, apparently.
Well, he mentioned, that is, you just heard there, the Iranian Foreign Minister, Javad Zarif, mentioned the INF Treaty. Now, Martin, this is actually quite important, isn't it? This is the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which Trump pulled out of back in February, because he's saying that the Russians have violated it. Well, the Russians also pulled out literally the day after Trump pulled out of it, saying, well, if you're going to pull out, there's no point in us just having this treaty on our own, and we're just about to run out of the 6 months period of grace where either can rejoin it. Well, I mean, why are these intermediate nuclear forces important?
Well, if you remember back in the 1980s when Cruise and Pershing were being deployed in Western Europe, as it then was, and in Britain at Greenham Common and so on, these were dangerous for two reasons. The Pershing missile, which was based in Germany, could hit Moscow very, very quickly, and therefore the other side had to be on a complete hair trigger. In 1983, when that programme that you were talking about earlier, the ZOO programme, we nearly had a nuclear war by accident in 1983. The Soviets were genuinely concerned that there was going to be a surprise attack on them, and don't forget that NATO's strategic doctrine has always been that we won't say we won't use them first. Both the Russians and the Chinese have always said we will never use nuclear weapons first, but NATO won't say that. And of course, the Americans have directly threatened to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states like North Vietnam and other.
Haven't the Israelis too?
Well, the Israelis basically, Sheldon Adelson, who's the biggest funder of the US Republican Party, said that we should turn Iran into a field of glass. That's what he said. That's what he wants.
Well, on this Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the BBC's Jonathan Marcus was interviewed about that and on the World Service, and he was asked, is the treaty dead?
Well, sadly, I think it is dead. It was a very important agreement during the Cold War years because it removed a whole category of weapons, what were then called intermediate-range nuclear forces. These were weapons essentially with which the Soviet Union threatened Western Europe and which from Western Europe weapons that threatened the Soviet Union. They were simply abolished altogether. The genesis of this row is that the Russians have been developing systems for a long time which the NATO side and the West believe broke the treaty. The Russians deny that, but the evidence, as far as we can see, is fairly considerable. And to that extent, the Americans said, well, if the Russians aren't going to come back into compliance, then we're not going to honour the treaty either. That deadline for the American formal withdrawal comes in just a short time.
Well, the reasons why the US have withdrawn from this treaty is because they want to threaten China with short-range nuclear weapons, based probably in Taiwan and Japan. And the INF treaty only covers, they want basically to be able to use weaponry. If you think of it from the Russian point of view, the NATO forces are much, much closer to them than their forces are to the hegemon, the Americans. So the danger for the Russians is a surprise attack, and don't forget they've got missiles in Romania and in Poland, which could be used for a surprise attack on Russia. And of course, what happened in the 80s was because they thought that there was going to be a surprise attack, they got everything on a hair trigger. Whereas if you actually have a situation where both sides are saying we'd never use them first, then everybody can relax a bit because it's clear that there isn't going to be a first strike from either side. But if the US is basically saying we want to keep the option of a first strike on the table, then inevitably the Russians are going to have to make their
The
response.
Russians are making a big fuss about the missile defence system, but surely that is, although it's in several places in Eastern Europe and there are more going in of these so-called missile defence systems, the Russians are saying that can be used offensively too.
Of course it can. Of course it can. And of course, if the Russians were to put similar missiles, say, into Cuba or Venezuela, you could see what the Americans would do. They'd go absolutely bonkers. And the Russians are saying, well, if you'd go absolutely bonkers if we did that, why should we put up for it when you do that to us? Their strategic doctrine is very clear. If you use nuclear weapons against us, we are going to go all out and we're going to wipe you out. And they've actually developed a whole new long-range missile structure, which means that within half an hour they can hit anywhere on the planet, right into the central Midwestern United States.
Now, this conflict is all over this Russian, NATO calls it the SSC-8. The Russians call it the Noviator 9M729. Now, the Russians say that it doesn't have the range that the Americans say it has. They say that the range is just less than, or just more than, I'm not sure actually.
Yeah,
but anyway, there's a disagreement about the capabilities of this weapon.
Well, I mean, the problem is the geography of the situation is not the same. The Russians can threaten Western Europe with a short-range missile, but they certainly can't hit the US unless they put them in somewhere like Cuba. Yeah? Which is what they tried in the 1960s, and it nearly led to a nuclear war. But of course the Americans have deployed similar missiles in Turkey, and the deal at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis is we will take our missiles out of Cuba and you get those missiles in Turkey out of our face. Now ultimately, if there's goodwill on both sides, you don't want short-range missiles pointed at everybody's face. You just have long-range missiles which will probably never be used because it just means nuclear holocaust, mutually assured destruction. The problem with the Western strategic doctrine is that they still think in terms of fighting and winning a nuclear war. The Russians aren't interested in that, so if there's a nuclear war, we're just going to kill you all. That's it.
Jonathan Marcus also responded when he was asked, what do you think NATO will do in response?
Well, I think the first thing it isn't going to do is deploy more missiles of its own. I think that would be very unpopular in terms of public opinion. I think public opinion has in many ways moved on since the 1970s and 80s. I think you will see robust steps. You might see more anti-missile defences being deployed, for example, and so on. But I don't think we're going to get into a kind of missile arms race for shorter and medium-range systems deployed on the ground in Europe.
Well, I think that's right, because the Russians aren't going to take the bait. They've got long-range missiles which can wipe out, for example, the US 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean in an afternoon. They can wipe out cities if they want to in the central United States. They're not going to piddle around with lots of short-range weaponry. That's NATO's game. NATO wants to spend money on lots of expensive kit anyway because it's a boondoggle. The Russian defence industry is virtually entirely nationalised. Every penny they spend on missiles is penny they can't spend on butter. So they think very carefully about what they actually need, and they're not just developing stuff for the hell of it, which of course was what happens in the West.
There's no point in talking to the monkey. Let's talk to the organ grinder, that is to say, Jens Stoltenberg. And he spoke to the BBC yesterday. He's the Secretary-General of NATO on this treaty.
These new Russian missiles, which they now have deployed over some years, are nuclear capable. They can reach European cities within a few minutes, so they're reducing the warning time and therefore also the threshold for any potential use of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict, and they are very hard to detect. They are mobile. So this is serious. We still call on Russia to come back into compliance, and Russia still has the opportunity to save the treaty by destroying the missiles they have deployed, which are in clear violation of the treaty. At the same time, we see that the time is running out. There's an absolute deadline, the 2nd of August, and we have seen no signs whatsoever that Russia is going to come back into compliance with the treaty. So therefore, we have to be prepared for a world without the INF treaty and with more Russian missiles.
So, Martin, all this work that was done during the Cold War by Reagan, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, the rest of them, it seems to be being torn up right now.
Well, it's if the Americans were genuinely seeking world peace and presenting a kind of pacifistic outlook to the world, we might take some of what they say seriously. But I'm afraid their credibility has gone. They lied about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They've lied about an awful lot of stuff. Their intelligence services are terrorists. They've been working with Al-Qaeda for years and years and years, as the Russians are well aware. And ultimately, you can't believe a word they say. And Jens Stoltenberg, the Norwegian, he's basically a low-level person. He just gets told what to say by the Americans and the British. And then he just comes out with it.
Just to clear things up, this disputed Russian missile, the 9M729, the Russians call it, or the SSC-8, they say that it has a range capability in excess of 1,000 kilometres, but not in excess of 5,000 kilometres. So this is about... what does this actually mean on the battlefield? Because some people are saying that it all makes... Having these sorts of missiles around makes a nuclear war more likely.
Well, the shorter range stuff... and the smaller stuff is probably the most dangerous because foolish people might think they could use them. The long range stuff is really, it's all or nothing when you use that stuff. But of course, the problem is there's a basic asymmetry in the geography. The Russians can hit Western Europe with something like that, but they can't hit the United States. Whereas, of course, NATO is right up on the Russian border now, and they can lob a nuclear missile over in a matter of minutes straight into the heart of the Russian.
Anyway, I thought maybe
heartland.
We should just get a little bit more of Jens Stoltenberg, since he's the guy who seems to be in charge in NATO, to go a little bit more
only on paper
in depth. What do you mean by that?
The head of NATO has to be a European by convention, but Stoltenberg basically he doesn't decide anything. It's decided. The generals in the Pentagon decide what's going to happen, and Stoltenberg just gets to read the script.
Okay, well, let's have a listen. Any power at all. Let's have a listen to him doing precisely that in Toronto earlier this week. Now,
Russia has deployed for several years now the new intermediate range missile, which is in clear violation of the INF Treaty, and therefore all NATO allies agreed when the United States announced in the beginning of February that they will start a withdrawal process from the treaty unless Russia comes back into compliance. So far, Russia has shown no sign of coming back into compliance, and the deadline ends on the 2nd of August, also in 2 weeks from now. But since there is still some time, we are still calling on Russia to come back into compliance, because we strongly believe that the INF Treaty have served us all well as a intermediate range as a nuclear forces. The treaty the INF Treaty has been and still is a cornerstone for arms control, because it didn't only reduce the number of intermediate range weapons, it banned them all. And that's the reason why it is so extremely serious that Russia is now violating this treaty, and the demise of the treaty will be extremely serious for all of us. As you know, the challenge with the intermediate range weapons is that the new Russian missile is that they are mobile, hard to detect, nuclear capable, can reach European cities within minutes, and by doing so they also reduce the threshold for any potential use of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict. And that's the reason why we take this extremely serious, the fact that Russia has now deployed these weapons for some time. If Russia doesn't come back into compliance, we will respond. I will not be specific today exactly on how we will respond, but we made some decisions at the defense ministerial meeting in June in NATO. What we will do will be measured, it will be coordinated, and we have said that we will not mirror what Russia is doing. We don't have any intentions of deploying land-based nuclear missiles in Europe. But of course we have other options. We have conventional, we have readiness of forces, we have exercises, we have missile defense, there are other options for NATO, and we will do what is necessary to make sure that in a world without the INF Treaty and with a more Russian nuclear-capable intermediate-range missiles, we will make sure that NATO continues to provide credible and effective deterrence. So we will respond, but we will respond in a measured and balanced way.
The NATO powers have deployed short-range missiles in Poland and Romania, pointed directly at Moscow. When they put them in, they said we're doing this to prevent the Iranians from attacking anybody. So the Putin was told at the time, we're putting these in, they're not directed at you, they're directed at the Iranians. And basically, the Russians just laughed, because these missiles are pointed directly at Moscow. They're short-range missiles, they're already there, and if the Russians were taking steps to put their own missiles, on a hair trigger, pointing back towards them, there's an obvious solution here. The NATO should just withdraw its missiles from Romania and Poland, which is what the Russians have been asking for years, but they won't do it.
And they're going to also install them in the Baltic states too.
Well, I mean, they did, but of course the Russian response could be that we're going to put our short-range missiles in Cuba. Because if you can put your missiles in our face, we can put our missiles in your face.
I'm not sure what the Cubans would have to say to that.
Well,
but anyway, also
the Venezuelans would probably say, yeah,
in the
we'll have them.
In the New York Times this month, just a couple of weeks ago, NATO is considering missile defence upgrade, risking further tensions with Russia.
Well, the real problem here is the desire to try and make the Russians do what we want instead of talking to them like adults about how we could share the world together. And that's because there's a military-industrial complex in the West in which a lot of ex-generals and all the rest of it they retire and they go on the boards of these companies, and it pays their pensions and puts their kids in private schools.
Absolutely right.
Public
You're absolutely right about the Iranian angle, because the Russians are saying, well, why do you need this system? Now the Iranians have agreed in 2015 to stop any nuclear enrichment program and threatening it to direct missiles at the alliance's interceptor sites.
Well, in other words, but it's just bad faith, isn't it? Everybody can see that these missiles in Romania and Poland are not directed at the Iranians, they're directed at the Russians. But NATO pretends that it's nothing to do with the Russians, it's all to do with the Iranians, even though they haven't got a nuclear weapon. And so, the fact is that NATO just lies. And of course, there's an easy thing that they could do. They could say, we won't use nuclear weapons first, which is what the Russians have always said. But NATO won't do that. And don't forget that the US has used nuclear weapons on Japan and has threatened to use them on other non-nuclear states several times since World War II. They threatened to use them in Korea. They threatened the North Vietnamese with them. The North Vietnamese said, go on, we dare you.
But ultimately, Martin, this is just all sabre rattling right now. The idea is that by threatening these sorts of things, you can get people to do what you want because they'll be simply afraid of you. You don't have any intention of actually using them.
Well, you could say, but you could miscalculate that, couldn't you? Completely. And that's what may happen. A nuclear war will probably happen, if it happens, and God forbid that it should, by accident. It nearly happened in 1983. The colonel who was in charge on the Russian side was about to press the button, and then he had a word with himself and he didn't press it, and it turned out to be a flock of swans rather than missiles. So it's just as well that he hesitated, because if he hadn't hesitated, we wouldn't be here now having this conversation.
This is your award-winning BCfm. BCfm on 93.2, 24 hours a day.
If you're an EU citizen living in the UK, you will need to apply to the EU Settlement Scheme. The scheme is fully open and you have plenty of time to apply. It is free and all you need is your passport or ID card and to complete an online form. Support is available if you have any questions. To find out more and to apply, visit gov.uk/EU Settlement Scheme. Irish citizens or those with valid indefinite leave don't need to apply.
Now, Martin, on to a bit about the Labour anti-Semitism scandal. This is rolling on and on and on. I mean, it almost seems like every evening on Channel 4 News there's another blow. Somebody within the Labour Party has resigned or called for Jeremy Corbyn to do something about this. And now it's all moved to the idea of outsourcing the Labour Party's own disciplinary procedures to an outside body from the Labour Party, because people don't trust the leadership of the Labour Party to actually manage this whole process.
Well, the Panorama film, which has created the latest furore, is an absolutely execrable piece of journalism. The woman that's interviewed as supposedly the injured party used to be an employee of the Israeli embassy and was in fact, caught by Al Jazeera talking to a Mossad agent about destabilising the Labour Party on behalf of the Israeli government. At the same time, she's been presented as some kind of hard-done-by person. This is an orchestrated campaign against the Corbyn leadership of the Labour Party because of its pro-Palestinian views. And ultimately, of course, if we do go to war with Iran to keep the Israelis happy, then there's going to be a lot of egg over lots of people's faces, because this whole orchestrated anti-Semitism campaign, witch hunt, run from the Israeli embassy, there's no doubt about that they're behind all of this, is basically an act of war. And, the Israelis, of course, are heavily involved in international terrorism, along with the Saudis and our own intelligence services. And ultimately, of course, we may have to go to war with the State of Israel, just as we did in the 1940s.
Well, since you mentioned Palestine, there are a couple of meetings next Saturday, 27th of July at 2 p.m. at St Mary on the Quays Catholic Church. Mazin Kumzia, I hope I pronounced that right, he will be talking about End Times, a Palestinian View. He's a geneticist and biologist at Bethlehem University and founder of the Palestine Museum of Natural History and Biodiversity, which is a conservation project, an oasis for creatures and humans set in the heart of occupied Bethlehem. And then there's another talk at 7 p.m. next Saturday at the Palestine Museum and Cultural Centre, 27 Broad Street in Bristol. That one, it's Popular Resistance in Palestine, a History of Hope and Empowerment. So that's hopefully remember to read those out again next week. But anyway, staying on the anti-Semitism thing, Martin, new emails today show Jeremy Corbyn aides plan to influence the party's panel. Emails obtained by Sky News relate to a discussion about the makeup of a panel due to hear cases related to anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn's top aide instructed party officials to compile a dossier setting out how Labour's highest disciplinary body could be challenged. Leaked emails have revealed Mr Corbyn's chief of staff, Carrie Murphy, said it was absurd the National Constitutional Committee, which operates independently of the party's governing body, was able to overrule concerns raised by the leadership.
Well, what's happening is it's an institutional infight. Many of the people who were put in positions of authority in the Labour Party as paid officials during the Blair era were very super pro-Israel. They just were. And if you look at all these people who are banging on about anti-Semitism, you actually look at their voting record, they all voted in favour of the war in Iraq, for example, like Margaret Hodge. So in other words, these people are not independent in their views.
I'll put a link up to this story on our show page. A Jewish group claimed the emails show the party's leadership want to interfere over anti-Semitism cases and are not prepared to let the NCC be independent.
Well, a political party doesn't have to have independent people looking into it. At one stage, the Board of Deputies of British Jews are saying they wanted to appoint an ombudsman to look into the Labour Party and decide who was and who was not anti-Semitic. Now, these people are basically Tory voters, and they're insisting that they can have somebody that decides what the Labour Party can and can't do. Ultimately, this is about politics. The State of Israel is in flagrant violation of international law. If they were called Serbia, we would already bomb them. But they're called Israel, so we basically have to kowtow to them. It can't go on. It can't go on.
So anyway, earlier this week I spoke to Anton Chaikin, and his father was involved in the American Jewish boycott of Nazi Germany back in the 1930s. And I asked him what he made of Labour and the anti-Semitism row.
You can have a laugh at some of this, because if you examine the attacks against Mr. Corbyn, Labour Party leader, on this account that his faction is anti-Semitic, these attacks emanate from institutions and billionaires associated with the City of London and the offshore system. I've looked into this quite a bit. You have the same kind of thing that goes back to the original problem in the 1930s. My father, Jacob Chaikin, was the legal director and strategist for the boycott against Nazi Germany carried out by the American Jewish Congress and the American Federation of Labor. This boycott against Hitler was before Hitler had really a big army to start a war, but he was in power. And that boycott was opposed by the leading Jewish bank in Wall Street, the Kuhn Loeb, and their organization, the American Jewish Committee. They were intensely loyal to the British system and to the international system that at that time was promoting Hitler and Mussolini. And they held press conferences in New York to denounce the boycott against Hitler Germany. That was in 1933. My father was an FDR Democrat. And thank God we had FDR to stand up to Wall Street and to force Churchill. I mean, Churchill and the British stood up to bombing, but Churchill and his faction wanted to keep the war going on forever. They didn't want to overthrow Hitlerism. They wanted to have a war that would be perpetual. And we finally were able to invade France, and together with the Russians and with the bravery of the forces, including the British and everybody else that was on our side, and the Chinese, we won that war. But the war continued after that. I don't think World War II was ever concluded. That's the problem. We've got to bring that to an end and go and simply say that the alliance that we had in World War II to fight fascism should be resumed and enhanced. We should have the friendship between the great powers, all the great powers, to preserve civilization and take it further. Civilization is worth saving, despite radical environmentalism, despite whatever atheistic doctrines can be brought up now. Civilization is precious, and it's something we ought to acquaint our children with and work with between the great powers to solve our problems, including solving things like terrorism. We don't need wars to do that. The wars are causing the terrorism, not solving them. We need, for example, you want to solve the ISIS problem, have the great powers send their troops into the banks in Saudi Arabia and London and shut down the bank accounts, shut down the drug supply for the people on amphetamines carrying out these terrorist operations in Syria, and make peace with we have no real enemies of nations. No nation is our enemy. Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, all the ones that are talked about in Washington, or that Washington is pushed to go against from London. It's insane. All the nations have the same interest, and that is to have a future with in industry, science, and high skills and high wages that come from those things.
That's Anton Chaikin there speaking to me earlier this week. Martin, I mean, he's really implying there that World War II never ended. He's saying that actually we have now got together with a fascist faction, which were the Nazis in the Second World War, to carry on the fight against Russia.
Well, as you know, Tony, a lot of top Nazis were integrated into NATO's intelligence structure from the get-go. Reinhard Gehlen, the former head of the Gestapo in Eastern Europe, became the head of the West German intelligence services after the war.
And what about what he was saying there about the bank Kuhn Loeb and the American Jewish Committee that the bank ran and controlled and funded versus the American Jewish Congress and the Federation of American Labor that his father was involved in, that constructed the boycott against Hitler in 1933?
Well, that's right. And of course, the main group one of the groups that collaborated with Hitler were the Zionists, who were a tiny minority in the world Jewish community, but they wanted the same thing as Hitler wanted. They wanted the Jews out of Germany. They wanted them in Israel, and there was a scoping meeting where a top Zionist activist and a SS colonel went to what was then British Mandate Palestine to look at the possibility of German Jews going there, and there was a medal struck with the Star of David on one side and a swastika on the other.
What was the American Jewish Committee doing supporting Hitler and Mussolini in the 30s then?
Well, don't forget that the oligarchy all over the world supported Hitler and Mussolini because they smashed the communists and prevented the possibility of any kind of socialist development out of the economic crisis of the 1930s. And, just as, some Jews are wealthy billionaires, and they sided with the other wealthy billionaires to support to keep Hitler and Mussolini going as a means of smashing their political opponents on the left.
Representing the entire city, this is BCfm. BCfm 93.2.
We finished this evening by having a listen to Catherine Austin Fitz. She is comparing here African and modern slavery and is really concerned about the move towards keeping all our money in little microchips.
If you look at where the currency system is going, you have an effort to develop digital currencies that will be far more conducive of surveillance, invasion, and I think of even chipping people. Tim Wu wrote a fantastic book that I'm always recommending. It's one of the best books for 2018 in the annual wrap-up, and it's called The Master Switch, and he describes the history of information technology, where there's a period of blossoming and innovation, and then, bam, it's used to centralize. And on each process of centralization, the central control grows. Mm-hmm. And my concern about what's next in terms of next in terms of currencies is I think where the leadership wants to go is they basically want to be able to collateralize a human being. So if I can integrate digital technology into you, then I can track you and I can use you as collateral. And you're back. Collateral. Okay, so let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. One of the books that most profoundly affected me over the last 2 years was a book called The Half Has Never Been Told. It's a history of the economics of the American slave trade. Mm-hmm. And there were two things in it that really stunned me. One was the slave population built up on the East Coast, and they decided as it built up to create three large corporations, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, to really build a cotton juggernaut, and they had a mass migration of slaves into those plantations. And one of the things they stipulated was that 70% should be single males between the ages of 17 and 35. Mm-hmm. And when I was reading the book, I was also doing an interview of someone about the European immigration situation, and I went to the EU website, and they noted that on all the immigrants that had come into Europe and also Germany that year, 70% were single males between 17 and 35. Oh. And I said, apparently it's the same playbook. Mm-hmm. It hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. That was number one. The second thing was there were two reasons why they canceled the slave trade. And one of them was that the banks in London kept losing money because every time commodity prices would drop, the plantation owners would sell the slaves west, and there was no way for the banks to prove that slave belonged to them. Mm-hmm. So there was no way to perfect a lien. There was no way to collateralize. If you can integrate digital technology into humans physically, suddenly you can. And that is a huge change. I think there is a tremendous effort underway to encourage people to accept wearing chips, mm-hmm. integrating chips into their body. And the reality is, as soon as you can do that, you can use a human being to collateralize a loan. Yeah. And then you're talking about taking away one of the primary reasons why they canceled the slave trade.
Well, fascinating little tidbit there from Catherine Austin Fitz, Martin.
Yeah, I've just been reading a book about the cotton industry and the history of it in the 19th century, and of course the plantations were worthless without the slaves. So the slaves were definitely, the banks would lend to plantation owners.
So are the banks taking us back via a vicarious route to the slave days?
Well,
I mean, they talk about wage slavery, don't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, the powerful have always tried to use any methods they can to keep the poor at their mercy.
OK, time to sign off for the US-owned Comcast News at 8. Thanks to our guest in the first hour, Lib Dem prospective parliamentary candidate for Bristol West, James Cox. You'll find this show's podcast story links comment page and our contact details at this week. One word. .org.uk. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling. Here's wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable BCfm weekend. Our sister show Dialects here next Tuesday at noon. We go to Glastonbury. Do please join us for the politics show at 6 o'clock next week. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.
From the Sky News Centre at 6, a man who lied about a murderous paedophile ring involving famous people, prompting a £2 million police investigation, has been jailed for 18 years. 51-year-old Carl Beach repeatedly told officers he had been abused in the 1970s and 80s by a string of high-profile figures. Daniel Janner QC is the son of the late Labour peer Lord Janner, who was falsely accused. He's furious.
Well, they've made us physically sick. When these allegations came out, we knew they were false, and they've been proved to be lies. Evil lies for money. So it's caused destruction in our family. It's very hard to get over this.
Yesterday looks to have broken records as the hottest day ever in the UK. Provisional temperature readings from the Botanic Gardens in Cambridge show a high of 38.7 degrees Celsius. Environment scientist Angela Terry says if the record's not already broken, it will be soon.
We're coming into August now, and if it's not this year, it'll be in the next few years. The temperatures will keep going up because we keep producing greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, which trap more of the sun's heat.
The hot weather has led to travel problems on the railways and at airports across Europe. A technical issue with a radar that caused huge delays at Heathrow and Gatwick has now been fixed, but passengers are being warned of continuing disruption. A man's died after he was hit by a car and dragged along the road in what police are calling a horrific attack in southwest London. Detectives have launched a murder investigation because they think the 25-year-old was targeted in a premeditated hit and run in Chessington. Labour says it's been calling for police numbers to be increased in England and Wales for 3 years. The new Prime Minister says efforts to recruit 20,000 more officers will start within the next few weeks. And in sport, there was a bizarre end to today's Tour de France. A hailstorm meant it was abandoned, with Egan Bernal awarded the section win. That's the latest.
What's good, people?
David
It's Jace from Dadcast with the Mandem, and I'm just letting you guys know that you can no longer find us on BCfm Tuesdays at 10. That's because we've moved. We're now on Mondays, 9 p.m. So catch me, Kinney and Joe for the award-winning Dadcast with the Mandem, where we talk all things fatherhood in the 21st century. And it's all about you guys getting involved too, so make sure you're locked in Monday nights from 9 p.m. on BCfm 93.2.
BCfm 93.2 is proud to support the Bristol Central Football Festival. The festival is a week-long opportunity for young people to develop their football skills under the guidance of some of the most qualified and experienced coaches in central Bristol. Featuring a skill theme for each day, penalty shootout, keepy uppy challenge, and is for boys and girls aged 6 to 14 years old. For more information and to book a place, go to www.bristolcentralfc.co.uk. The Bristol Central Football Festival, 5th to the 9th of August. Book your place today.
Wake up! I try to play my music, they say my music's too loud. The One Love Breakfast.
Wake up to the One Love Breakfast every weekday morning from 7 a.m. BCfm 93.2, keeping Bristol together. Come and join the thousands of people who care about our city and the diverse communities that make it up. Wake up to the One Love Breakfast, Bristol's only local breakfast show that celebrates diversity. Every weekday from 7.
Bristol's One Love Breakfast is the people's choice.
BCfm. This is Bristol. It's Friday, 6 o'clock. Welcome to BCFM's Politics Show. I'm Tony Gosling. Helping me review this week's news is Councillor for Knoll and Lib Dem leader in Bristol, Gary Hopkins. Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers is here too. After the 7 o'clock news, a newish president in Malaysia and a new documentary on the 2015 downing on a flight from The Hague to Kuala Lumpur of MH17 over Ukraine. It's MH17 A Call for Justice, the film, and it's produced by freelance Dutch journalist Max van der Werf. And you won't be seeing it on the BBC. Why? Because it implicates the fascists in Ukraine and NATO and the Dutch authorities in falsifying evidence that Russia did it, and covering up the real culprits, whoever actually did shoot the plane down. Plus tanker wars, latest. It was this time last week, wasn't it, that the Iranians boarded a British registered tanker. And we go back to 1987, just before the first Gulf War, when US warships were escorting Kuwaiti tankers by sending them out ahead in case of mines, with the American warships chugging along behind. Not much of an escort, if you ask me. And YouTube have been censoring my videos this week, classifying the linking of Israelis to the 9/11 attacks as anti-Semitic hate speech. And Yukiya Amano dropped dead this week. Poor Yukiya. But who is he, I hear you say? Only the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Authority, charged with the oversight of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And no special tariffs on Huawei, just the FedEx's postal company is refusing to deliver their mail. Just another provocation against China from the Trump administration, jealous of a Chinese tech company with a market lead. That's all in the second hour, after the US-owned Comcast News at 7. On to our news review in a minute, but first Bristol's 2 weekend weather forecast from theweatheroutlook.com. Tonight, lows of 15 Celsius and dry. This weekend, temperatures around 22 Celsius, the highs. Light cloud with some sunny spells and light rain on Sunday. So a little bit less wet this weekend than we forecast last weekend. Next week, that's highs of 24, plenty of sunny spells and some showers midweek. Next weekend, that's the 3rd and 4th of August. Highs of 24, mainly sunny, so the heat and the sun should continue. It looks like, apart from Sunday, a bit of rain. That was Bristol's 2 weekend weather forecast from theweatheroutlook.com. So joining me to review this week's news is Councillor for Knoll and Lib Dem leader Gary Hopkins. Hi Gary, welcome to the Politics Show.
Hi.
We're going to start this week. Well, obviously Boris is the big news of the week, but we're going to start here with Marvin Rees, the mayor, the Labour mayor. He's managed to get all but he's going to be the candidate, isn't he, again next May in the mayoral elections.
Yes, a lot of Labour members were trying to get him deselected, but the process was too difficult for them to enact that.
Tell us a bit about that process. Well, what do you mean?
Well, it requires all sorts of different organisations. There's ward parties. There are various socialist societies. As an example, the local Labour Party here in this area actually called a meeting to deselect him. Not to deselect, but to call for an open election. So you had to face other opponents, but they were one short of having a quorum at the meeting. So despite 85% wanting rid of him, it was recorded as a no vote.
I mean, his campaign for re-election amongst the Labour Party was standing really on a ticket of various things, including having saved the libraries and stopped the council tax reduction scheme from being taken away.
Well, it's beyond parody, isn't it? I mean, I think it was Tom Lehrer said when Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, that's exactly the same situation with Marvin now. At the debate in council, nobody was paying any attention to what he was claiming because he's just such arrant nonsense. He apparently has massively improved house building, but the actual numbers are about half what they were 10 years ago in Bristol in terms of affordable houses as well as overall houses. He was claiming to have saved the libraries. He's claiming now to have delivered the new waste recycling centre in South Bristol. The money's been sat in a pot for 6 years, and because they're now starting to make plans to get a business case together, he's claiming that he's done it. Well, I mean, it's in the same way that George claimed when he was up for re-election that he'd built the arena. I see no arena.
It's a pity that Marvin can't be here to answer some of these charges, Gary. And I mean, ideally, as a journalist, I'd much rather have him answer rather than me. But he doesn't want to come on the radio. He just simply will not come on this show. We see him on the BBC from time to time and on the podcasts. And he's done his address to the City Council. But why do you think he refuses to sit on the seat next to you here?
Well, I think he refuses to go anywhere where he might get some awkward questions. He wants to be in control of how the message is put across. I don't suppose he'd have 100% confidence of that happening here.
The scrutiny boards on the City Council are one of the places where the Mayor, Marvin Rees, Labour Mayor, is held to account. And here is from last week's Scrutiny and Management Boards, where Marvin talks about some of the boards he's set up in order to help run policy in the city and actually direct spending so that he can decide where money gets spent, with these boards making some recommendations to him. The only trouble is, of course, that there is no actual councillors on these boards, and they're rather self-selecting, aren't they?
He banned the councillors. Apparently a councillor from another party, not from ours, I won't say who it was, from another party he claims was rude, and actually the particular councillor was thrown out by council security officers from the meeting that was actually happening of one of those boards. And since that time, because he claims that one councillor was behaving badly, all councillors were banned.
Okay,
ridiculous.
When you say it's but behaving rudely, is that sticking one's tongue out, or what exactly does that constitute?
I don't know, I wasn't there, and what Marvin constitutes as behaving rudely is normally actually challenging him on things. I've got to say that the most rude and obstructive and downright abusive person I've ever had to deal with has been Marvin over the last couple of years. He regularly harangues the public gallery in the council, which is quite ridiculous. So him claiming that people have been rude is just, well...
Anyway, let's go to the scrutiny board, where Marvin talks about some of these boards he's been creating to bypass councillors.
What we've done in these boards is pull together a remarkable range of people who were saying, we will come together and work with Bristol to agree what we want to get done. This is about saying that the solution to the challenges facing the city will not be dreamed up by to be perfectly frank, and ever since I've come in, councillors have been at pain to express their frustration with full council and cross-party working. It won't be dreamed up from what goes on within this councillor or even council officers. We will only be able to come up with the solutions to Bristol's challenges and the challenges that were contributed to on a national and international level by working with the wider city. And that's what we've done. In terms of attendance, if I can say, we did have them open at the beginning, but actually, and I talked to a particular party leader, we had some councillors come up and started to behave as though the city partnership meetings, where we were working with outside partners, were city council meetings where councillors were trying to take chunks out of each other and be very rude. And what that meant is that one of the important things when we bring people together is that we maintain an environment in which people are putting solutions on the table and not trying to score points. So we knew we had to safeguard that space. And to be honest, I'm even feeling it now. If people are up for entering into genuine partnership work, well, I think if people are up to entering into genuine partnership working and being solutions focused, then they can engage. But I would also say you have a whole machinery in this organisation that gives you the opportunity to engage in political debate, and I say you should make best use of it.
So, Gary, that was a question that was put by Anthony Negus from your group. And Marvin, I think, answered it quite robustly there, saying that you're just not solutions-focused. If you're looking for a solution, then Marvin's happy to work with you, but you're not.
Well, the trouble is that if it isn't his solution, then it isn't a solution as far as he's concerned. Everyone asked the wrong questions, according to him. The whole world asked the wrong questions, apart from Marvin. And it's quite amusing that one of these boards is the Transport Board. Do you know, Marvin actually has an advisor from First Bus Group, sat in his office telling him what to do, and that board is actually run by First Group.
Well, I doubt he's telling Marvin what to do. He's just saying, look, this is what's possible and this is what's not. I've worked for the bus company. I know you want to get them sorted, so I can liaise for you.
Well, I'm afraid when we found out about this chap, we asked for a meeting with him. And he came along with a minder from Marvin's office, so he knew exactly what was being said. And the chap, all he wanted to do was to give propaganda against franchising, which is what is needed in this city. And basically it wasn't even objective criticism, because every system has its weaknesses. No, he was feeding in this propaganda to Marvin, and he thought he could do exactly the same to us.
Amazing. Anyway, Martin Summers, you're a Labour Party member. Marvin Rees, the Labour mayor there, saying that solutions won't come from councillors. They're coming from outside on these boards, people he's inviting onto these boards, like businesses, basically, in the city.
Well, this is basically the problem with a mayoral system. He's got the power to do that. He can overrule councillors. That's what the Tories set up. Mayors are allowed to do that.
But I mean,
whether
that's
it's right or wrong,
that's what the city voted for when they voted for a mayor.
Well, they didn't vote for a mayor, did they? As Gary well knows, it was a minimal turnout.
That's the fault of people like you who should have voted against it but didn't bother to turn out. Well, not enough people did, surely.
And crucially, the Tories who campaigned for it are now admitting they were wrong.
Yes, it's a silly system. And I think, obviously, Marvin comes in for a lot of personal criticism because of the way he's taken hold of this role. But the role itself is...
But George did as well in his day.
Well, yeah, but George also campaigned in favour of it. And Marvin's taken over where George left off, which is that basically mayors are supposed to be like sort of CEOs running, Enron. They can sack people, they can do what they want, and it's supposed to get things done. And, of course, the subtext of that is get the things done, which the powerful in the city have always wanted to do, but all this boring democracy has got in the way, and that's the fundamental problem what we're dealing with here.
Anyway, the mayor gave his annual address last week, and here's a little extract from that where he talks about Channel 4. Although I thought Channel 4 decided not to come to Bristol, apparently they are.
We're also the new home for Channel 4. We hosted them here on Friday. They'll be opening their offices in October, not only bringing a huge economic boost to our creative sector, but also joining with us as a partner in bringing greater diversity to that sector. And we've also launched the One City plan. The door's open. You've got ideas, email the boards, get involved. Many of them are statutory boards. Some of you probably even knew about them before because they've been around for some time, even though you seem not to. But you can absolutely welcome to reach out to any of those boards and share your ideas and your input as you like to as you feel to. So we came into office with a commitment to delivery, and I believe that's what we've done. That's what we're seeing. That's why we're attracting the support of government, investors. It's why you see cranes on the horizon. We committed to Bristol being a city that was inclusive and sustainable. These characteristics are writ large in what we've delivered in our corporate strategy and the One City plan. And finally, I'd say every year we make the same offer. If you want to get stuff done, if you're prepared to put aside, the ping pong of chamber politics, and you want to come and say what you actually want to get done for Bristol, and you can tell me what you need from me to help you do it, let me know. I'm all ears. We'll work with you, and we have included people in those pieces of work sometimes until things begin to disintegrate. We want to hear from you. But if you want to play headline chasing, bite my ankles, talk the city down, and spend time searching for small problems with big plans, then I'm afraid I have to leave you to it. There's too much going on for us to get tied up in that. But whatever your conclusion on where you want to stand, we're going to continue committed to our promises for Bristol, and we're going to continue delivering for Bristol. Thank you.
That's Marvin's annual address from last week from the full council meeting. Gary, I looked up on Channel 4's website. It says actually that they're going to Leeds, not to Bristol. Do you know any more about this?
There are smaller offices, about 3, I think, around the country.
Because there was a big bid. Bristol was involved in a bid to try and get Channel 4 to come to Bristol, and they said, no, we're going to Leeds instead.
That's correct.
But Marvin's sort of saying, well, actually, they are coming here.
Well, there are smaller, sort of like regional offices, not their main head office, which I believe one of them is coming to Bristol. There's about three or four of those in addition to the main head office, which is going to Leeds.
Channel 4 themselves Channel 4 staff are saying up to 90% of their staff are going to quit rather than move to Leeds. Martin, do you think this is this anything really going to happen here in Bristol? We're going to see Channel 4 News doing a little bit more reporting from Bristol?
I don't know, because it's just a matter of factual stuff. It's either true or it isn't true. But it sounds as if, as Gary knows more than I do, they're going to put a small office here, but we're not going to get the headquarters. That's what it seems to be.
Also, Gary, this use of we came into office. This is a bit almost royal, isn't it?
Well, I mean, Marvin is Queen Victoria. Interesting concept. But basically, there has been a massive failure. I mean, I listened to that speech, and it was full of stuff that just wasn't true, stuff that they claimed to have succeeded on, and other stuff where, he saved the libraries. Well, no, you tried to shut them, and you got stopped from shutting them.
Well, he says the door is open, you can always email these boards, but that doesn't actually mean the door is physically open, does it? You can send an email, and then you can just hit someone that hits delete.
Yeah, man, I'm sorry, but, he's listening even less than George was. And Martin's right, it's a function of the position.
So what
he's stuck at the top of an ivory tower, he's not listening to anybody.
So what is this One City plan? Are you just a bit sore with it because it excludes you, Gary?
No.
What does it mean? What is One City plan?
It means nothing. Basically, it's a whole load of waffle for saying we're all jolly, we're all working together, and we don't need a council, and Marvin's wonderful, and all his partners are working together. It's absolute baloney.
Martin, do we need a council?
Well,
maybe Marvin's right.
Well, I think this is the problem, that the whole concept of having a mayor is bringing what you might call private sector ideology into local democracy. It's the idea that if we've got somebody in charge to get things done, bang heads together and all the rest of it, as if we're it's D-Day and we've just got to get the Marines into shape and get them onto the beach. Local politics isn't about that. It's about building consensus. And that's why, for many years, we had a parliamentary system where you become the leader of the party that wins the election, and then you form a coalition, and you have to negotiate with various people to get anything done. And of course, the developers and the other people who want to get things done, arenas and all the rest of it, that's far too boring and long-winded for them. They just want somebody to do it for them, and that's what the whole concept of mayors was brought in from the United States by the Tories, and stupidly the Labour Party bought into it. And I don't think Sadiq Khan's got any power, really. I mean, one of the problems is they give them all this they're supposed to do all this stuff, but they haven't actually got any power to do anything. And then they pretend they've got the power.
Okay.
It's silly.
So the leader of the Conservative group on Bristol City Council, he replied to Marvin's speech by saying he thinks democracy is being squeezed out of the city.
I have seen in the last 12 months we've had the gerrymandering of the Constitution. We've seen that, so that it limits the scrutiny. We've seen the debacle over chief executive pay and all of the rest. We're going to discuss that later. Again, a choice, I might add. We've seen the debacle over the arena and the choice there to go from the city centre, put it out on the outskirts of the city. A choice made against the express wishes of the majority of this chamber and the majority of citizens. Now, if this, it was against the majority of this chamber, I'm going to repeat this, if that model had been made under the cabinet and leader system, then, colleagues, I suspect you'd have made a choice too. Because I don't think a leader of a cabinet would have remained in office either after the arena or after the chief executive payout. I don't believe that at all. There were checks and balances in that system. There are none in this system at all. The Prime Minister position has more checks and balances than we have here in Bristol.
Is that true? The Prime Ministerial system's got more checks and balances than Bristol? Marvin can do exactly whatever he wants and no one can stop him?
Yeah, I mean, the Prime Ministerial system does have its disadvantages, but at least the Prime Minister can be removed when a number of his party actually realise he's gone loopy.
As we've just seen, in fact. Maybe the next one will go loopy.
Well, it won't take long, I don't think.
What about this whole business of the auditor's report, which came up after that at full council last week? What's the background to that, Gary?
Well, basically...
we rely on our auditors, don't we? They go through the books and they say, well, hang on a minute, this is not on, and this is wrong, whatever.
Well, I think, actually, auditors have been getting a bit of a bad name for turning a blind eye to stuff that was wrong. Fair play to the auditors, the outside auditors for Bristol City Council, because they refused to accept the lie that the ex-chief executive had been paid off in accordance with what she was entitled to. They said, that is not true. The trouble is that they couldn't prove exactly what happened, because after the complaints started coming in, the shredders got busy. Emails got deleted all over the place. So there was a report came out which showed that there was huge gaps in terms of the council's record.
I mean, surely there are copies of emails at some point, no?
You must be kidding. So basically it's impossible without actually...
So this is something the auditors actually did go through and try and find these emails?
They tried to find stuff, but it was missing. A lot of stuff had just disappeared.
Ooh. Potentially that's covering up a crime.
And they weren't required to do a forensic examination of the situation, which would have involved interviews to check who had deleted what and when and exactly what happened. So they had to rely on the documents that they had in front of them, and they did as much as they could do, and they proved that the council had acted to misdescribe their accounts, and they forced the council to change them. Now that's very unusual, but they did that. But they
so how many sets of accounts were there this year at Bristol City Council?
Oh dear.
Too many.
I mean, it's how many emails there were and how many changes in contracts there were and all that sort of thing. Really, really messy.
Okay, so the comments on that were made by... this is just after the annual address at full council last week by Jeff Gollop from the Conservative group.
I'd like to ask Councillor Gollop to speak on behalf of the Conservative group.
Thank you, my Lord Mayor. In reading this report, I find that I agree with most of what's in it. The only problem is that I disagree fundamentally with what is not in it, and I ask that we have a vote on this, and if we don't have a vote, I wish my objection to be registered in the strongest possible terms, because I do not wish to be associated with it. And I'll tell you why. I'm sure everybody's read paragraph 10. The Audit Committee agreed 4 specific observations, and I'll concentrate on 2 of them. Should similar circumstances take place again, officers involved would be subject to disciplinary action, and members and the Mayor would be subject to a referral to the monitoring officer under the Members' Complaints procedure. My Lord Mayor, if that's the case now, why wasn't it the case then? Why was it not the case? Because we are not talking about rocket science here. We are talking about basic, fundamental business practice where integrity and ethics should be the basis of the actions that are being taken, and there should be transparency and the appropriate documentation. They were all lacking. Paragraph 2 says that all decision making in relation to the employment of senior officers to have proper documented trail for audit purposes. Now, I can only conclude that that means they weren't there. My Lord Mayor, this is a disgrace, and it is an embarrassment that members on all sides of integrity are supporting, acknowledging that we got this wrong, but pretending that by approving and noting this documentation we can brush it under the carpet. My Lord Mayor, that's not acceptable. I won't be associated with it. Thank you.
Well, sorry about the audio quality there. I think Jeff Gollop was getting so heated he was breathing onto the microphone and making a kind of a sort of wind noise of some sort. But anyway, Gary, so is there going to be any action after this? I think that's really what Jeff is saying there. He's hinting that this is simply not acceptable, but nothing's being done about it.
Well, I think the only way that it could actually happen now is a complaint to the Ombudsman. Whether people are proposing to do that, we'll see. The trouble is that some of those emails and records and paper records have been shredded and have disappeared. So actually doing anything about it is going to be progressively more difficult. And bluntly, it was a disgrace at the time. I think most people in Bristol have heard of it, know perfectly well what happened. It was an embarrassment. The woman was taken on.
So just to explain what the problem was and how much money was involved. Just go back to that, please.
Well, basically, a woman was taken on as chief executive despite very strong advice against. 7 months later, she suddenly disappeared, which we thought was very strange indeed. That had been after lots of accusations of bad behaviour, etc., had gone on, in which the media had been asking awkward questions. And then we heard a few weeks later, through the good offices of Private Eye and the rotten boroughs, that she'd left with a large payout, which amounted to £98,000, which the Mayor claimed was contractual and that she was entitled to, and which the auditors said, no, that's not true, that is a lie.
Fascinating. Well, anyway, maybe the police will be taking over where the auditors left off. Let's see. Anyway, last Prime Minister's questions this week between Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May, as Theresa May is heading out.
Mr. Speaker, let me conclude by welcoming some of the Prime Minister's notable U-turns over the last couple of years. The cruel dementia tax was scrapped. Plans to bring back grammar schools were ditched. The threat to the pensions triple lock was abandoned. Withdrawal of the winter fuel payments was dumped. The pledge to bring back fox hunting was dropped. And they binned their plan to end universal free school meals for 5 to 7-year-olds. The Prime Minister has dumped her own manifesto. Given that her successor has no mandate from the people, no mandate in which to move into office, doesn't she agree the best thing the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge could do later on today when he takes office is to call a general election and let the people decide their future?
To the right honourable gentleman is no. And if he wants to talk about people ducking manifesto commitments and commitments made during a general election campaign, can we remember what the Labour Party, the right honourable gentleman, said about student debt? Going to abolish student debt? After the election, no, he rose back on that promise, What did he say during the general election? He was committed to Trident. What does he say after the general election? No, he's not committed to Trident at all. He has broken promise after promise to the people of this country. But I say to the right honourable gentleman, as this is the last time that we will have this exchange across these dispatch boxes, to say that it is the strength of our British democracy that the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have these exchanges across their dispatch boxes every week at 2 swords length. No quarter is sought and none is given. And that's as it should be in our adversarial parliamentary democracy. But he and I are very different people and with very different politicians. I think we approach the issues we face in this country in different ways. I have spent all but one of my years in this House on the front bench trying to implement the policies I believe in. He has spent most of his time on the back benches campaigning for what he believes in, often against his own party. But what I think we both have in common is a commitment to our constituencies. I saw that after the terrorist attack in Finsbury Park Mosque in his constituency. But perhaps I could just finish my exchange with him by saying this. As a party leader who has accepted when her time was up, perhaps the time is now for him to do the same.
Well, she says that, but he's not going to, and it's just a rhetorical point, isn't it?
Yeah, but what about what's the wider point that she's making there about Jeremy Corbyn really being a sort of campaigner from the backbenches, whereas she's spent her political career has been. She's saying that we're very different people, very different politicians. She actually does stuff. He just sits and waves flags from the background.
She's very much part of the establishment, is she not? Jeremy Corbyn isn't, and that's his appeal.
And is he actually going to get any power?
Well, we hope so. Let's have a general election. That's what he called for.
What do you think, Gary? I mean, this is a terrible thing to ask you, I know, but if you had to choose one or the other of those two, who makes more sense to you, Corbyn or May?
Well, neither of them, obviously. That's why, for some while, that the country was terrified into voting for one to keep the other out, and vice versa. And now all of a sudden they've realised they don't have to do that, and it's a large percentage of people are looking for any alternative rather than Boris Johnson or Corbyn. And bluntly, I think Corbyn, the way he attacked her on the last Prime Minister's questions was absolutely stupid tactics. Surely he needs to be attacking the person coming in and, if anything, giving her a bit of sympathy and saying it was all these rebels that were causing all the difficulty.
Martin?
Well, I'm not going to second-guess Jeremy Corbyn's tactics here. I mean
actually, he did quite a good job there in marking all the different U-turns that the Tories have done over
she said she wasn't. She said, don't forget we've got a fixed-term Parliament Act, which the Liberal Democrats helped put in place, and she said there wasn't going to be a general election. Then she said there was going to be a general election, and she basically lost it, and that's why we're in the mess we're in. If she just stuck with what she said... Well,
actually, Jeremy Corbyn lost it, but he didn't quite...
No, but
she didn't quite lose it, did she?
No, but she didn't win it, though, either. And that's why the Democratic Unionist Party have got the country over a barrel, because Sinn Féin don't take their seats.
And that's a few more by-elections, and I don't think they'll have power to keep the Tories in place.
Well, we shall see. But the DUP's vote is solid.
One of Martin's supporters, someone Martin supports, I would imagine, is Yvette Cooper, and she had this to say about what would happen if there was a no deal to our national security here in Britain.
Cooper! We have disagreed on many things over the years, but the Prime Minister knows that I have long respected her resilience, her commitment to public duty and her seriousness, and also her work on national security. And I can reassure her that there is much to be done from the backbenches. But she will also know that I said to her once that I believed she was not the kind of person who would take this country into a chaotic no deal, not least because of the advice she had on the risks to our national security. I am fearful about her successor, so can she reassure me that she really thinks in her heart that her successor will take those national security warnings as seriously as she has, and if he doesn't in October, will she speak out? Here,
Prime Minister. I say to the Right Honourable Lady, first of all, I have every confidence that my successor will take all the issues that he needs to look at in making these decisions and others across government as seriously as they need to be taken. But can I also say to her, I'm sorry, and I will say this, she's absolutely right that I've always said that I believe it is better for this country to leave with a good deal, and I believe we negotiated a good deal. I voted 3 times in this House for a good deal. I spoke to the Right Honourable Lady about this issue. If she was so concerned about the security aspect of no deal, she should have voted for the deal.
Well, I find it rather odd, all this national security stuff. Wink, wink, nod, nod. We all know what we're talking about, except we don't know what we're talking about. It's just silly. There's no real threat to our national security by leaving the EU because NATO's still got this exactly where they want
What about information sharing amongst the European countries?
That's not really an issue, Tony. It's basically I'm a Remainer, as you well know, but it's basically a red herring of enormous proportions. The real problem is NATO, which is about to start a war in the Persian Gulf. Nothing to do with the EU at all.
Why did Yvette Cooper, who's complaining about not facing a no deal now, why didn't she vote for Theresa May's deal?
Because it's a Tory deal, and that's the way it works. And in actual
it's just playing party politics.
Well, it's playing party politics because that's our system. It's an adversarial system,
as
you said earlier.
This, Gary?
Well, it's not up to her to vote for it. It's up to May to bring forward a proposal which a majority of people in the House of Commons can actually support. I'm afraid she put down red lines right at the beginning of this, which meant that cross-party cooperation was never going to be happening. So she was handed the impossible job in the first place. That she was never going to succeed, and then she proceeded to make it even more difficult. So her demise was absolutely inevitable. But I do think that if Cooper there took a far more sensible line in terms of saying, the real problem is not you, it's your successor, which is entirely the case. And in terms of national security, it's not a matter of the spying, etc., but there is a problem with crime. We have a European arrest warrant at the moment, which actually some years ago the Tories were campaigning not to introduce and to get rid of, and basically it makes an enormous difference to the way that things actually operate in terms of catching criminals and bringing them back for justice. So, without that, there is a crime problem.
Also, one of the questions that popped up this week I found fascinating was about asset stripping companies. This is a German company apparently closing down some rail engineering factory. It does seem like, the Germans are just pulling their money out of the UK at the moment.
Mr. Paul Sweeney!
The Prime Minister has often spoken about the need for an industrial strategy during her time in office, but the St Rollox Railway Works in Springburn, affectionately known as the Cali, will be closed by its asset-stripping German owner Mutares on Friday, ending 163 years of engineering excellence and the jobs of 200 skilled workers.
Shame.
The Scottish and UK governments have both failed to intervene to save this strategic site since the closure was announced late last year, while the workforce has been left devastated. Even though the Prime Minister is losing her own job today, it's not too late for her to act now and to instruct the government to do everything it can to find a way to save these vital jobs and this historic railway works. Will she at least commit to doing that?
To the honourable gentleman, I recognise the concern that he's showing for his constituency and the worry and concern that there is for those people who are employed in the business that he has referred to. Of course, whenever we see closures of factories, closures of industrial sites, government does act to ensure that support is available for those who do find themselves losing their jobs, should that be the case. But can I also say to the honourable gentleman, he says that I said that I talked of having a modern industrial strategy. We have a modern industrial strategy. It is a modern industrial strategy which is setting the background and the framework which will enable the economy of the United Kingdom to be the economy for the 21st century.
Well, this whole idea of industrial strategy has reappeared after years of being told we didn't need one. The market could decide everything. And of course, with the privatisation in this country, we've ended up with Dutch and French state companies running our infrastructure.
So why? I mean, is it inevitable that the Germans are going to pull their money out of Britain?
It's not the Germans, it's the company. In actual fact, what's happening as a result of no-deal Brexit on the horizon.
Well, German investors have taken over this company.
It's not just German investors, it's Japanese investors. It's all foreign direct investment in this country is ground to a halt because of what's happening with Brexit, and that's probably going to cause a recession, which is going to lose this government its majority at the next election.
What do you reckon, Gary?
Well, absolutely, and we're hearing, we haven't lost hundreds of thousands of jobs. So
isn't it a bit spiteful? Isn't it a bit spiteful? I mean,
the real danger.
This company here, surely in Glasgow, which employs loads of people, is still going to continue to make money. They've just decided, we're just going to spite them.
Their duty is to their shareholders, and basically they're in a position. And that's what private companies are in a position to looking after their shareholders. If the present government actually make it more difficult for them to make money in this country than in Germany, then basically they're going to put the money back into Germany. And that's exactly what the government are doing. And it isn't that we've lost hundreds of thousands of jobs already. The real danger is the lack of investment in new jobs and new processes coming into Britain. And not just in manufacturing, in science and research, etc. Vast amounts of money are disappearing to Europe, which were coming to this country.
If you're an EU citizen living in the UK, you will need to apply to the EU Settlement Scheme. This means that the rights you currently have will be protected after the UK leaves the EU. The scheme is fully open and you have plenty of time to apply. It is free. To find out more and to apply, visit gov.uk/EU Settlement Scheme. Irish citizens or those with valid indefinite leave don't need to apply.
So we've got a new Prime Minister this week as well, Boris Johnson. Much as everyone predicted, this was going to happen. There's also the talk, Martin, about him. People saying, he's got great recognition across the Atlantic and in Britain. But doesn't that just mean he's been groomed for this for years?
Well, indeed he has. He's groomed himself and he's managed to wangle himself into the job,
I mean by
the
press, really. I mean, I can remember, now this is a David Cameron Prime Ministerial speech to the Tory Party conference. Gosh, we're talking about 6 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, and the BBC immediately put Boris on, the first person after the speech was finished, saying, what a great speech by... And, of course, these two were mates in the Bullingdon Club, weren't they?
Well, they all, and it's very incestuous, isn't it? I mean, they've all known each other for years, and they're just passing the ball from one to the other as the economy and everything else goes down the drain.
Okay, you went to Oxford. Is it just as simple as if you go to Eton and Oxford, then you're going to be, and you're one of the boys in the club, then they say to you at the time, they tap you on the shoulder and say, you're going to be great, you're going to be a leader one day, you're going to be a political leader.
When I went in the late 1970s, we had the highest proportion of state school students at Oxford University ever, and it's now gone gone back to what it was previously. And I remember in the early 1960s, Wilson was saying we've finished with the Grousemore school of government in this country. We're going to have, clever people from all over running things, and the belted earls and lords and everybody, they're gradually going to be squeezed out. But that's certainly not the case, is it? In this country today, we've got exactly the same 18th century style Whig oligarchy running things, and nothing's changed.
OK, Gary, with Boris, he's famously did these two articles, didn't he? One which was pro-Brexit, the other which was anti-Brexit. It was almost like he's going to flip a coin and say, well, I'm going to be this or that. And so it does give you the impression that he's just totally opportunistic and he'll go whichever way he wishes to.
Absolutely. And as our new leader, Joe Swinson, has said, all that Boris is interested in is Boris. And basically, he's completely unfit to hold any senior office of state. And anyone watching the mess that he made as Foreign Secretary, the worst I think we've ever had, should have been warned then as to how dangerous he was.
But he's more positive than Theresa May. She seems to be a sort of merchant of gloom most of the time.
Well, I've known undertakers who are rather more positive than Theresa May, but that's not really the test.
What about this whole thing of charisma and people saying he's a bit like Winston Churchill? Is that just his speechwriters, or is there something to that?
Oh, my goodness, what an insult to Winston Churchill. Nobody is ever perfect, but to compare this charlatan to somebody who was a great leader...
Martin, he does seem to try to emulate Churchill a bit in the speeches that he reads.
Well, it's history repeats itself the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. That's Karl Marx. I mean, the thing about him, what's amazing to me about what they've said in the last 2 days is that they're going to cut taxes for the wealthy. We're going to have 20,000 more police officers. We're going to schools are going to get all this, and I simply, my head's exploded. I thought there was a deficit. I thought the banks collapsed and there was no money for anything. But now we're going to have Brexit. There's money to burn. There's not just one magic money tree. If you look behind Boris, there's a whole forest of them with loads of money. I mean, they were there all along.
The other thing, of course, is he's brought Joe Johnson into his cabinet, who famously resigned because the Conservatives didn't want to have a second referendum, Gary.
Well, rather bizarre. We'll see how some of these appointments actually work out in practice. I think the time to actually start really judging him is when some of these chickens are coming home to roost. I mean, he's proposing to leave the EU without paying our bills. In the end, that generally gets you into difficulties. And I think that Britain is in serious danger if Boris carries on like this, becoming a political pariah, because nobody wants to do business with somebody who doesn't settle their bills.
What about the demise of Jeremy Hunt, for example, Martin? He's out, isn't he? I mean, he's the guy who was really behind this beginning of this tanker wars, by taking over the Iranian tanker in Gibraltar.
Well, he was probably told to do that by somebody else, but let's not go into that. I think what's interesting about this, he got 1/3 of the votes of the Tory party membership, and you'd have thought that he might have been found some kind of a role, but obviously not. That's the obvious big take-home from what's happened this week, is this has been absolutely, even people who supported Boris Johnson, who didn't support him enough, have been kicked out. This is definitely, he's got everybody in place who he wants to be in place.
OK, I'll read out a few of the new...
He's certainly going to take the blame if anything goes wrong now, isn't he?
In the new cabinet, and I'd just like either of you to chip in when I'm finished and give any particular comments on any of them, really. So we've got Sajid Javid as the new Chancellor, Priti Patel as the new Home Secretary, Dominic Raab as the new Foreign Secretary, Stephen Barclay, the new Brexit Secretary, Michael Gove is Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Ben Wallace, Defence Secretary, and Liz Truss, International Trade.
Well, if I can just quickly chip in, a lot of these people participated in the pamphlet that came out some years ago called Britannia Unchained. And I can't remember who said it. I think it was Kwasi Kwarteng saying that British workers are the laziest in the world, and that's why we don't get anything done. That's their attitude towards that.
Priti Patel's got a big job here as Home Secretary. She, I seem to remember, was sacked because she had not declared trips to Israel, and she was actually taking a donation donations towards her trips and things like that from the Israeli government.
Well, that's right. Similarly to Liam Fox, of course, because he was taking his mate Werrity into...
So Fox is out, but Mogg is in, isn't he? Rees Mogg is in as the leader of the House of Commons.
With Fox, I'd be interested to hear what Gary's got to say about this, because Liam Fox had a job of being, supposedly international trade secretary or whatever it was. A whole department was created for him, and he went round the world trying to do deals with people, finding out that there was nothing to do in, and he's gradually been educated in office, and he's suddenly realised that we can't just do trade deals with everybody. It doesn't work like that, and that's why he's out, because he's got an element
Gary, what do you make
understanding.
Of saying goodbye to Liam Fox? He's a local MP, but he's no longer around, is he?
Well, no. The thing is that, yes, he did start to see a bit of reality. And he hung on with May to try and actually pull the sides together a bit, and completely failed, of course. So he can't be around because, as far as Boris is concerned, he's a bad smell. And anything that...
Kingswood MP Chris Skidmore was Universities Minister, not in the Cabinet, but a junior minister. He's been kicked out, and Joe Johnson, I think it is, has taken over as University Minister. So he's put his brother in rather than Chris.
Well, I suspect that Joe Johnson knows where rather more of the bodies are buried, so I think that's part of the reason why he's been brought in.
OK, so we've also had Donald Trump weighing in, saying, well done, Boris.
Really good man is going to be the Prime Minister of the UK now, Boris Johnson. Good man. He's tough and he's smart. They're saying Britain Trump. They call him Britain Trump, and people are saying that's a good thing. That they like me over there. That's what they wanted. That's what they need. That's what they need. He'll get it done. Boris is good. He's going to do a good job. I think Nigel's someplace in this audience. Nigel Farage. He's here someplace. I'll tell you what. He got 32% of the vote from nowhere over in UK. Nigel. Thank you, Nigel.
That's Trump, actually, Nigel Farage over at a Trump rally while this is all taking place. Do you think he's going to get on all right with Trump, Martin? I know you're laughing over there, but these two it's going to be a great rapprochement between Britain and America.
Well, it's very interesting. It's good. We're going to have an immediate test of this question of the oil tankers and all the rest of it, aren't we? So never mind Brexit. Are we going to war with Iran to keep the Israelis happy? Come on, you've got 10 seconds to answer. Beep. Time's up.
What do you make of Trump and Boris, Gary?
Well, I think that tells you everything you need to know how dangerous Boris actually is. When you look at Trump being one of his mates, that really is sickening. Well, and I think people who have supported Brexit need to be thinking, hang on, we're moving away.
I mean, there is some evidence, though, that Boris is a bit more realistic. For example, about Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, Martin. He is what he says is he's just told it like it is. This was a gaffe.
It was an absolute mess up. Let's not just to remind the audience what happened there. He was probably told that she was training journalists and that she was basically working for MI6. Then he told everybody what he wasn't supposed to tell.
So he doesn't know when MI6 are telling him something. He doesn't know he's not allowed to talk.
Say that on the news. Can I just make
I thought he was the foreign secretary.
Yes, well, can I just make another point, which is he said about Trump when Trump first appeared on the scene that he was absolutely unfit to be president. I wonder if Trump knows that. Perhaps we should be playing back, like Trump going on about WikiLeaks.
Well, we can certainly have a go at that. But also, I mentioned there briefly Jacob Rees-Mogg taking over. Well, he's now got a cabinet job as the Leader of the House. What is the role of the Leader of the House, Martin?
Well, I'm not really quite sure.
I know they organise business of the House, and they negotiate.
I know Robin Cook became Leader of the House, didn't he? After the
they negotiate the business of the House with the Speaker. That's one of their jobs.
I think one of the things about being that role is that you sit in cabinet even though you don't have a cabinet responsibility. It's a way of paying Rees-Mogg off.
But basically he's a money man, and here is Robert Peston on Wednesday evening talking to Rees-Mogg about the current state of the economy and whether Boris is going to be able to sort it out.
The annual deficit is much lower than it was. It's come down significantly. You've seen with corporation tax that actually having a tax cut has led to more revenue. You've seen a revision by the ONS recently of an extra 0.5% of GDP because they were undercalculating it. So there is money around selectively as long as the money is spent prudently.
But the national debt is still well over 80% of GDP. I would have imagined somebody like you would be nervous about a Prime Minister who might well push up that ratio of debt to the amount that we produce in this country.
I don't think anything he's proposing would push up the ratio of the national debt, and that after 9-10 years of austerity, that you can't continue austerity forever, and the national debt will decline on the current forecasts, and there is some headroom as well.
Well, isn't it interesting? We've suddenly found all this headroom which didn't exist 6 months ago because we need to spend money to win an election. But of course, think about the Police Federation people we've had on here over the last few years, all decrying the cuts in police. So experienced police officers have been sacked, and now we're going to recruit 20,000 rookies. Just like that, because we can, because money's no object. Because, of course, as you well know, in America, they've got this onto a T. The right wing can run at any deficit it likes, but the left wing are accused of being profligate if they do.
Gary, what do you make of the newly ennobled Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Well, again, it's a little bit like Trump, isn't it? You know, you judge people by the friends they keep, and I'm afraid he's one of the most odious politicians I've ever seen.
Why do you say that? I mean, a lot of people have got respect for him. I mean, he seems to stick to his principles when it comes to Brexit, for example.
Well, stick to his principles. This was a person who was calling for Brexit and then was actually voting against the deal that his own government had negotiated.
So, Boris's first speech as Prime Minister was yesterday, where he said he was going to bite the bullet.
Whatever deal we do, we will prepare this autumn for an economic package to boost British business.
That's Wednesday.
And to lengthen this country's lead as the number one destination in this continent for overseas investment. And to all those who continue to prophesy disaster, I say yes, there will be difficulties, though I believe that with energy and application they will be far less serious than some have claimed. But if there is one thing that has really sapped the confidence of business over the last 3 years, it is not the decisions we have taken, it is our refusal to take decisions. And to those who say we cannot be ready, I say, do not underestimate this country. Do not underestimate our powers of organisation and our determination, because we know the enormous strengths of this economy in life sciences, in tech, in academia, in music, the arts, culture, financial services. It is here in Britain that we are using gene therapy for the first time to treat the most common form of blindness. Here in Britain that we are leading the world in battery technology that will help cut CO2 and tackle climate change and produce green jobs for the next generation. And as we prepare for a post-Brexit future, it is time we look not at the risks but at the opportunities that are upon us.
Well, I'm afraid it's nonsense, isn't it? I mean, investment in this country is decreasing. It really is quite frightening. And if he actually takes the jump off the high board into the swimming pool with no water in it, which is what he's proposing to do at the moment, we all suffer very, very badly. And it's not just immediate, it's over a period of years.
I mean, it sounds to me, Martin, like he's doing what you wanted, really, which is, despite the deficit, for the government to start spending its way out.
Well, this is going to be a very interesting general election, isn't it? Because the Labour Party has been accused of spending money that didn't exist, and the money's all gone and all the rest of it. And then as soon as, at this point, they've suddenly swerved, and now money's no object. We can spend any amount of money on anything.
Anyway, yesterday Boris gave his first speech in Parliament.
No country that values its independence and indeed its self-respect could agree to a treaty which signed away our economic independence and self-government.
As Prime Minister.
This backstop does. A time limit is not enough. If an agreement is to be reached, it must be clearly understood that the way to the deal goes by way of the abolition of the backstop. For our part, we are ready to negotiate in good faith an alternative, with provisions to ensure that the Irish border issues are dealt with where they should always have been, in the negotiations on the future agreement between the UK and the EU. I do not accept the argument that says these issues can only be solved by all or part of the UK remaining in the customs union or in the single market. The evidence is that other arrangements are perfectly possible and are also perfectly compatible with the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement, to which we are, of course, steadfastly committed. My team and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, are ready to meet and talk on this basis to the Commission or other EU colleagues whenever, wherever they're ready to do so.
And the Leader of Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, pointed out that actually Boris had only just recently, 4 months ago, voted for the backstop, even though now he's decided he doesn't seem to like it at all. Let's also hear from Nigel Farage, who has this to say about he thinks there should be an early general election.
The country voted leave. The country is still leave. Arguably, the country is more leave than it was 3 years ago. And Parliament just simply doesn't accept the result. That's the logjam. That's the problem that we have here. So Boris faces the most enormous challenge. Either he says, well, I'll just break my promise and we'll kick the can down the road for a further 6 months. But if he does that, he risks electoral oblivion for the Conservative Party. Or what he does is he goes for a big, bold general election. But here's the problem. Since you and I last spoke, something different has happened in British politics. A new party has come along. It's called the Brexit Party. It won the European elections heavily. It's still polling very high out there in the country. And the only way Boris could win that election, he must come to some kind of accommodation with me and with the Brexit Party.
That's pretty accurate, but it's not going to happen.
Basically, if there's a general election, the Liberal Democrats would be the biggest winners because basically the Tory vote would be split with the Brexit Party, and there's hundreds of seats where we would pick up seats. There's a serious danger, I know it sounds mad, that we would actually be the largest party in Parliament.
Okay.
I think there's no chance of the Tories or Labour having a majority.
That's our guest, Councillor for Knoll, Lib Dem leader Gary Hopkins. Thank you. Join me after the US-owned Comcast News at 7 as we take our weekly look at world news.
Award-winning community radio station for Bristol, bringing you national news on the hour. Live from the Sky News Centre.
From the Sky News Centre at 7, 2 pro-Brexit campaigners have admitted harassing